Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. So, get cozy, dim the lights, and let the hum of your Pip-Boy light our way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our full Fallout playlist for more sleepy stories from the wasteland. And if there's a Fallout tale you want to hear next, drop it in the comments. Now, close your eyes, breathe deep, and drift into the world of Fallout, where dreams wander just beyond the horizon. Welcome, fellow traveler through the ruins of a world that did not end by accident, to a quiet and careful examination of the most deliberate cruelty that the old civilization produced before it destroyed itself. Tonight, we do not explore the bombs, though the bombs matter. We do not explore the wasteland, though the wasteland is where everything we are about to discuss eventually arrived. Tonight, we explore what came before the wasteland, and beneath it the sealed rooms, the locked doors, the people who walked through those doors believing one thing and encountered another, and the institutions that designed the encounter with the specific, patient, methodical intention of researchers who had decided that human beings were the most interesting material available for their purposes. So settle in now. Let your body find the position it needs. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of something older and quieter than the world outside. There is no urgency here. The experiments are over. What remains is only the account of them, and the account can be received gently, at whatever depth sleep allows, as the story moves through you the way wind moves through the long grass of a field that was once a city, the world that ended on October 23rd, 2077 carried within it, in the months and years before its ending, a secret of such comprehensive moral failure that the bombs, when they finally came, were in certain respects the less disturbing part of what that civilization had produced. The bombs were catastrophic and final, and beyond any individual's capacity to have prevented by the time the sirens sounded. They were the consequence of decades of institutional failure, of resource wars and escalating desperation, and the particular kind of political calculus that results when the people making decisions about weapons have ceased to believe, in any functional sense, that the people who will die from those decisions are real in the way that they themselves are real. The bombs were enormous, and they were terrible, and they were, in their own way, honest. They made no claim about their purpose. They offered no false comfort. They did not tell the people they killed that what was happening to them was for their own good. The Vault program was different. The Vault program told the people it consumed exactly that. 122 Vault-Tec shelters were commissioned across the continental United States in the years before the Great War, each one presented to the public and to its eventual inhabitants as a monument to the government's commitment to civilian survival, a network of underground facilities capable of sustaining human populations through the duration of a nuclear exchange and its aftermath, equipped with everything that a community would need to endure decades of isolation and emerge, when the surface became habitable again, ready to begin the work of rebuilding. The marketing materials that Vault-Tec produced for its shelters were masterworks of the particular aesthetic that the pre-war period had perfected, bright and clean and saturated with the cheerful confidence of a civilization that had decided, at the level of its public presentation, to simply decline to acknowledge the things that should have been keeping it awake at night. Families smiling in clean corridors, children playing in common areas bathed in warm fluorescent light, overseers depicted as benevolent authority figures, steady hands on the wheel of a community, navigating temporary adversity toward an assured eventual emergence into a world made better by the ordeal. People believed it. They had reasons to believe it, and they had reasons to want to believe it, And the distinction between those two categories of motivation is one that the people who designed the program understood very well and exploited with considerable sophistication. The America of 2077 was a nation under pressures that its public culture was working very hard to render invisible resource scarcity, military overextension, the particular anxiety of a civilization that understood, at some level, beneath its official optimism, that the trajectory it was on did not lead anywhere comfortable. Into this anxiety, Vault-Tec offered something that the anxious mind reaches for before it reaches for almost anything else: the assurance that someone was prepared, that plans existed, that the worst that could be imagined had been anticipated and provided for. People paid for vault spaces. People competed for vault spaces. People placed their trust, completely and with the specific vulnerability of those who genuinely believe they are placing it somewhere worthy, in the institution that told them it was building them a future. What Vault-Tec was actually building was a laboratory. What the people who purchased spaces in that laboratory were actually purchasing, without any disclosure of the terms, was participation in research that most of them would have refused in horror if anyone had been honest enough to describe it to them. The 122 vaults were not, at the level of their actual design and institutional purpose, a network of survival shelters. They were a network of controlled experiments, each facility assigned a specific research protocol, each protocol designed to test a specific hypothesis about human behavior, social organization, biological resilience, or psychological endurance. Each experiment requiring a population of human subjects who could be confined, monitored, and subjected to specific conditions without their knowledge or consent for periods measured in decades rather than years. This is the story of what those experiments were, and what they did, and what came out of them on the other side. It is not a comfortable story, and it was never meant to be. But it is a story that deserves to be told completely and without flinching, because the people it happened to were real people, and real people deserve the acknowledgement that their suffering was suffered by someone, and that the institutions which produced it were not a natural disaster but a choice made by specific human beings, for reasons that those human beings understood and accepted and never publicly confessed. The doors are open now. Let us go inside. To understand what Vault-Tec built, it is necessary first to understand what Vault-Tec was not as a corporation in the ordinary sense of that word, with the ordinary motivations of market position and shareholder return that govern the behavior of commercial enterprises in functioning economies, but as something more specific and more troubling than that. Vault-Tec was a company that had achieved, in the final decades before the Great War, a position that no private enterprise in a nominally democratic society should ever be permitted to achieve, a position so deeply embedded in the apparatus of government that the distinction between the corporation's interests and the government's policy had become, for all practical purposes, theoretical. The defense contracts that had made Vault-Tec wealthy were not merely commercial relationships between a government purchaser and a private supplier. They were the architecture of a dependency so complete that by 2077, the United States government's survival planning was functionally indistinguishable from Vault-Tec's business development strategy. This relationship had not been built overnight. It had been constructed across decades of carefully cultivated institutional intimacy, the movement of personnel between government positions and Vault-Tec leadership roles that Washington had once called the revolving door and had long since stopped pretending to regulate. The flow of classified research funding through channels that made public oversight essentially impossible. The gradual accumulation of classified agreements between the corporation and specific elements of the military and intelligence apparatus that gave Vault-Tec access to research, to populations, and to protected operational space that no commercially motivated entity had any legitimate reason to possess. By the time the Vault construction program was announced to the public, the collaboration between Vault-Tec and the government was so thoroughly integrated that the program's public face, a humanitarian shelter initiative, a demonstration of government preparedness, a promise to the American people that their survival mattered could be maintained with complete sincerity by the people delivering it, because those people were not the people who knew what the vaults were actually for. The people who knew were fewer, and they were not making public statements. What they had designed in the classified annexes of agreements that would never be declassified because the government that classified them ceased to exist on October 23rd, was a research program of a scope and duration that no ethical framework governing human experimentation had ever contemplated approving, because no ethical framework governing human experimentation had ever imagined that anyone would propose it in these terms. The Vault program would provide Vault Tech and its government partners with something that medical and behavioral researchers had always been denied by the constraints of civilized society: a captive population, comprehensively monitored, with no access to outside information or outside intervention, who could be subjected to specific experimental variables for periods lasting not months or years, but generations. The question of whether those populations consented to this research had been resolved at the level of institutional policy simply by not asking it. The people entering the vaults were told they were entering survival shelters. Consent to participation in a behavioral study was not part of the transaction because disclosing the nature of the transaction would have ended it. Each vault had been assigned an experimental protocol before its construction was completed, before the first inhabitant had been selected, before the first lottery had been held, before the first family had paid for their space and received their orientation materials and been told where to go when the sirens sounded. The experimental designs had been developed by research teams within Vault-Tech's classified divisions, reviewed and approved by government liaisons whose identities were protected by the same classification systems that protected the protocols themselves, and built into the physical infrastructure of the vaults at the architectural level. The particular conditions that each experiment required, the specific environmental manipulations, the designed resource constraints, the controlled social variables were not added to the facilities after their construction, but incorporated into them from the beginning, in the placement of ventilation systems and water supplies, and food dispensers and communications equipment, so that the experimental conditions would be as invisible as possible to the people they were applied to, and as permanent. The overseer system was central to this design, and central to it in a way that revealed the program's most essential moral logic. Every vault had an overseer, an individual selected by Vault-Tech and granted absolute authority over the vault's population, whose legitimacy within the sealed community derived from the institutional framework that had placed them there. In the majority of experimental vaults, the overseer was provided with more information about the nature of the experiment being conducted than the general population was given, not necessarily the full truth, but enough to understand that their role was administrative in a sense that extended beyond the welfare of the people in their care. They were accountable, in the final analysis, not to the community they administered, but to the program that had appointed them. And this accountability survived the death of every institution that had created it, because the overseers of sealed vaults had no means of communicating with any authority beyond their own walls, and no incentive to undermine the authority those walls had given them. What the overseer system produced, across the different vaults and the different degrees to which different overseers understood what they were administering, was a spectrum of institutional responses to an impossible position that is, in its way, among the most human elements of the entire program's history. Some overseers appear, in the terminal records that survived the opening of their vaults, to have inhabited their roles without meaningful moral conflict, to have understood their experimental mandate as a legitimate institutional obligation and administered it with the thoroughness that obligation seemed to demand, finding in the authority they had been granted and the mission they had been given a framework sufficient to contain whatever discomfort the specifics of that mission might otherwise have produced. Others struggled. The terminal entries of certain overseers document a slow and losing negotiation between the trained conviction that the protocol must be maintained and the lived experience of knowing the specific people whose welfare was being sacrificed. to it of watching children grow up inside conditions that had been engineered to study them, of presiding over the particular suffering that each experiment was designed to induce, and of continuing anyway, because the alternative was to abandon the only account of their own role that made that role feel acceptable. The experimental protocols themselves had been organized in Vault-Tech's internal documentation, according to a taxonomy of research questions that revealed the program's institutional assumptions about what was worth knowing. There were experiments designed around social organization, what kinds of community structure would emerge when specific variables were controlled or manipulated. There were experiments designed around psychological resilience, what conditions human beings could endure, across what timeframes, before the cognitive and emotional functions that defined them as persons began to fail. There were experiments designed around biological transformation, what radiation and engineered pathogens could do to human genetic material, and what the resulting organisms would be capable of. And there were experiments that defied easy categorization, that seemed designed not around any specific research hypothesis, but around a more diffuse institutional appetite for information about human behavior under conditions that the researchers found interesting. In the way that people with access to captive populations and no accountability sometimes find things interesting because the opportunity to observe them is available, and the cost of the observation is borne entirely by others. The control vaults were an essential component of this architecture, and their existence is necessary for understanding what the program as a whole reveals about its designers. A meaningful experiment requires a baseline, a condition in which the experimental variable is absent, against which the conditions in which it is present can be measured. Vault-Tech's research designers understood this, and they designated a small number of facilities as control vaults, facilities whose populations would be provided with everything a vault was supposed to provide, without deliberate manipulation, and observed to see what a functional, well-resourced underground community would produce over the same timeframes in which the experimental vaults were observing the effects of their respective interventions. Vault 8, located in what had been northern Nevada, was the most significant of these control vaults. It received a functioning GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, a Vault-Tech device loaded with the agricultural and environmental technology necessary to support the establishment of a surface settlement and a population of inhabitants who were provided with the resources and social structures required for a functional community. Vault 8 opened on schedule. Its inhabitants emerged onto the surface, used their GECK to establish a settlement, and over the following century built what became Vault City, a prosperous, technologically advanced community with medical care, clean water, and a standard of living that was, by post-war standards, extraordinary. What Vault City also built, in the same process, was a social order so rigidly organized around the distinction between its own citizens and everyone outside its walls that it had, within a few generations, produced a community whose technological prosperity was inseparable from a comprehensive contempt for the less fortunate populations surrounding it. The experiment designed to produce a baseline had instead produced its own disturbing result, evidence that the provision of adequate resources and functional institutions was sufficient to sustain physical welfare, but not sufficient, on its own, to prevent the specific social pathologies that emerge when a community begins to understand its own survival as evidence of its superiority over those who did not survive as well. This was not what the control vault's designers had intended the baseline to show. It was, however, what the baseline showed. The vault program's most fundamental deception was not any specific experimental manipulation, however cruel. It was the foundational premise on which the entire system rested, the claim that the people inside the vaults were the program's beneficiaries, that the institution had been built for their welfare, that the massive infrastructure of sealed doors and life support systems and overseer authority existed in service of their survival. None of it was true. The people inside the vaults were not the beneficiaries of the program. They were its material. The institution had been built not for their welfare, but for the welfare of the research questions that their confinement made answerable. The sealed doors and the life support systems and the overseer authority existed not to protect them, but to ensure that the experimental conditions remained controlled and the experimental population remained available for continued observation. They could not have known this when they walked through those doors. They had been told something else entirely, by an institution whose capacity to tell convincing lies was as sophisticated as its capacity to design the rooms those lies were designed to fill. And the particular moral weight of what was done to them, the weight that distinguishes betrayal from mere harm, that makes the Vault program something other than simply a catastrophe, is inseparable from the trust that the program required as its precondition. They believed. They had been given reasons to believe and reasons to want to believe, and in the space between those reasons and the truth, Vault Tech had built 122 rooms and filled them with people whose survival was, from the institution's perspective, not the point. The point was the data. What follows is the account of what that data cost. There is a particular kind of cruelty that does not announce itself as cruelty. It does not arrive with violence or with the immediate rupture of something that was previously intact. It arrives instead as a condition, as the simple, sustained arrangement of circumstances in which a human life must be lived, day after day, across years and then decades, in ways that shape everything that life becomes, without ever offering the person living it a moment of clear crisis. They could identify as the thing that was destroying them. The slow experiments, the experiments of isolation, of social engineering, of sealed communities, subjected to controlled conditions across generational timescales, were this kind of cruelty. They were designed not to break the people inside them in any single dramatic moment, but to observe what those people became when the conditions of their existence were arranged, from the beginning, according to specifications that served the research rather than the community. The people who lived and died inside these vaults never experienced a single moment of deliberate harm that they could have pointed to as the experiment. They experienced, instead, the experiment itself, which was their lives, in their entirety, arranged according to someone else's research questions. Vault 13 sat beneath the Californian desert at a remove from the nearest settlement that had been chosen with the specific logic of controlled research far enough from other post-war communities that no contaminating information could reach its population, close enough to a network of cave systems that the vault's physical position offered a plausible environmental rationale for its location. Its inhabitants had been selected with the same careful attention to demographic representation that characterized the more elaborate Vault Tech experimental designs, a cross-section of the kind of people who might realistically have obtained vault spaces in a mid-sized Western city, carrying with them the specific knowledge and skills and interpersonal dynamics of a community that had been, in its pre-war form, neither exceptional nor particularly prepared for what was about to be asked of it. The experimental protocol assigned to Vault 13 was, in its stated form, simple. The population would remain sealed for 200 years. The overseer's specific instruction was to delay the vault's opening for as long as possible, using whatever justification the overseer found persuasive, including, if necessary, the manufactured or genuine failure of a critical piece of infrastructure. 2 centuries of isolation was the independent variable. What a community became in 200 years of sealed existence, with no external input and no contact with whatever world was developing on the surface above them, was the question the experiment was designed to answer. What Vault 13 produced was something that no research protocol, however carefully designed, could have fully specified in advance: a community that had developed its own internal culture, its own traditions and social hierarchies and mythologies over such an extended period of self-referential existence that by the time outside contact finally became unavoidable, the people inside the vault were not merely unfamiliar with the surface world. They were, in the most fundamental sense, unprepared for the concept of a surface world as a place they were actually required to inhabit. The children born in Vault 13 had parents who had been born in Vault 13 and grandparents who had been born in Vault 13, and the vault was not, to any of them, a temporary measure or a waiting room for a life that would eventually begin somewhere else. It was life. The corridors were the landscape, the recycled air was the atmosphere, the fluorescent cycling of artificial light was the sun, and the scheduled maintenance periods were the seasons, and the particular social texture of a few hundred people who had known one another their entire lives and whose parents had known one another their entire lives was the complete and sufficient universe of everything that community meant. When the vault's water chip failed and the overseer was finally compelled to send a single resident, the person who would come to be known as the vault dweller, out into the world to find a replacement, the action that the experimental protocol had been designed to prevent for 200 years was accomplished not by any institutional decision, but by a mechanical failure that the research designers had apparently not considered a significant risk within their experimental timeframe. The vault dweller who emerged into the California wasteland was not a person walking out of an emergency shelter after a temporary period of protective isolation. They were, in the most complete sense, a person from a different world, carrying the values and knowledge and emotional frameworks of a community that had been sealed from external influence for 2 centuries. Encountering a landscape that the experiment's designers had never expected any Vault 13 resident to encounter at all. What the Vault Dweller found, and what they did with it, and what eventually became of Vault 13 when the full truth of the Vault's history was finally understood by those who had lived within it. These are the consequences that no experimental protocol had included in its research questions, because the research questions had never accounted for the possibility that its subjects would eventually step outside the controlled environment and become agents in a world that the control environment had not prepared them for. Vault 101, in the capital wasteland region of what had been Virginia, operated according to a protocol that was both simpler and more absolute than almost any other experimental design in the program's history. Its mandate could be stated in a single sentence: no one ever enters, and no one ever leaves. But the simplicity of that mandate concealed an experimental design of considerable psychological sophistication, because the question being asked was not merely whether a population could sustain itself in permanent isolation, but whether permanent isolation, maintained across generations with the absolute authority of an overseer empowered to enforce it by any means necessary, could produce a community that genuinely internalized its own confinement. Whether the people inside could be brought, through the combined operation of institutional authority and the simple absence of any alternative, to believe not merely that they were unable to leave, but that leaving was something no rational or moral person would choose to do. The answer, as it emerged from the generational history of Vault 101's sealed existence, was yes, and the yes was more complete than the research question had perhaps anticipated. By the time the vault had been sealed for more than a century, the population within it had developed a cosmology that made the vault not merely their home, but the totality of meaningful existence. The outside world, in the shared understanding that the vault's generations had constructed and transmitted to their children and their children's children, was not an alternative to vault life that had simply been made unavailable. It was a concept essentially without content, a name for an absence, for the space beyond the walls, carrying the same emotional valence that earlier civilizations had given to the realm of the dead. The overseer's word was law, not primarily because the overseer had the mechanisms to enforce it, though those mechanisms existed, but because the vault's inhabitants had, over generations, come to understand the overseer's authority as simply the way things were, as natural and inevitable, and as little open to question as the recycling of the air they breathed. This made the arrival of the lone wanderer, the resident whose departure from the vault broke the experimental condition that had been maintained for over a century, not merely a logistical crisis for an institution designed around absolute containment, but a psychological catastrophe for a community whose entire understanding of itself depended on the proposition that the vault's rules were as permanent as the laws of physics. The lone wanderer's exit was not experienced by those who remained as the departure of an individual from a community, in the ordinary way that communities experience the departure of individuals. It was experienced as the rupture of a foundational belief, as evidence, suddenly and devastatingly present, that the world the vault had described as its inhabitants' complete reality was not complete at all, that the overseer's authority was not the expression of some fundamental truth about the nature of human existence, but an institutional arrangement that a single person had been able to simply walk away from. The civil conflict that followed the overseer's violent response to the lone wanderer's father, the rebellion led by the overseer's own daughter, the fracturing of a community that had been held together precisely by the belief system that the departure had just disproven, was not a failure of Vault 101's social order. It was the social order working exactly as its designers had specified, revealing what was underneath it when the central experimental condition was removed. The fate of Vault 101 after the lone wanderer's return is a study in what happens when a community is finally given a choice it was never supposed to have. Some inhabitants chose to open the door. Others did not. The division was not between those who were braver and those who were more timid, or between those who were more rational and those who were more fearful. It was between those whose psychological investment in the vault's cosmology had made the outside world genuinely unthinkable as a place they could inhabit, and those in whom the revelation of the door's openness had unlocked something that had been sealed inside them as thoroughly as the vault had been sealed against the world. Both responses were entirely comprehensible consequences of what the experiment had done to the people who had lived within it, and neither response was what the people who had lived within it would have chosen if they had been given an honest account of their situation when they were young enough for the account to have shaped them differently. Vault 29, in the Colorado region, pursued its research question through a selection methodology that was, even by the standards of a program that had produced experiments of considerable callousness, striking in its willingness to use the most vulnerable possible population as its experimental material. Only children under the age of 15 were admitted. No adults were permitted entry. The community that would live and die within Vault 29 would be, from its very first day, a community without the generation that normally holds a community together, without the people who carry institutional memory, who have already learned the hard things, who know from experience rather than theory what cooperation and governance and the management of conflict actually require. The vault would be populated entirely by children, and those children would be raised not by parents or elders but by a ZAC supercomputer programmed to provide the specific education that the experimental protocol required. What ZAC's 1.3c taught the children of Vault 29 was not, or not only, the practical knowledge of how to operate and maintain the Vault systems. It taught them a philosophy, a comprehensive framework for understanding the world that emphasized the primacy of nature, the spiritual significance of the living environment, and a deep, foundational suspicion of the kind of advanced technology that had produced the Great War and everything that followed it. The children who grew up in Vault 29 were educated to value the natural world that they had never seen, to distrust the technological civilization that had destroyed it, and to understand themselves as stewards of a future that required a fundamentally different relationship between humanity and its environment than the one that had preceded the bombs. This was not an accidental curriculum. It was a designed one, and the community it produced insular, philosophically shaped, deeply suspicious of outsiders and of the technological sophistication that outsiders might represent, was the community the protocol had intended to produce. Vault 15, in the Mojave Desert region, pursued its research question through a different kind of social engineering, one that operated not through controlled education or enforced isolation, but through the deliberate creation of irreconcilable internal tension. The four groups sealed together within Vault 15 had been selected precisely because they were incompatible, because the researchers who designed the protocol believed that ideological diversity, maintained under conditions of resource scarcity and permanent confinement, would produce social dynamics worth observing. What the experiment was testing was not whether such groups could coexist, but what form their failure to coexist would take, how quickly incompatibility would express itself as conflict, and what the resulting social configurations would look like after the initial fracturing had run its course. The answer arrived faster than any controlled research timeline had likely anticipated. Vault 15 was not a community that fractured slowly across generations under accumulating pressure. It was a community that fractured decisively, repeatedly, and with consequences that extended far beyond its own walls. Because the groups that left Vault 15 at different points during and after its history did not disappear into the wasteland as isolated individuals. They became the founding populations of the specific factions that would shape the political landscape of California's wasteland for the following century: the Great Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackal's raider gangs, each tracing their origins directly to the specific cultural groups that Vault 15's irreconcilable mixing had eventually expelled into the world. While the settlers who eventually left to found Shady Sands carried with them the specific combination of values and knowledge and social organization that their Vault experience had produced. The unintended consequence of Vault 15's experimental design was therefore the single most significant act of political seeding in the post-war West, an experiment designed to observe what incompatible groups would do to one another in a closed space by ejecting those groups into an open space at different times and with different psychological profiles, shaped by their different experiences of the Vault's conflicts, created the founding populations of the factions whose interactions would determine the character of the wasteland's emerging civilization. The new California Republic that eventually arose from the region owed its existence in part to Vault 15, to the settlers who left and built Shady Sands, and the raider culture that the Republic would spend decades attempting to manage, owed its existence to the same Vault, to the groups that left with nothing but their mutual hostility and the specific toughening that years of internal conflict in a sealed space had provided. The researchers who designed Vault 15's protocol had wanted to observe the effects of ideological diversity under pressure. What they produced instead was the ideological map of a civilization. There is a meaningful distinction between experiments that produced suffering as a byproduct of their design and experiments that required suffering as their fundamental operating principle, that could not generate the data they were designed to generate except through the deliberate and sustained infliction of harm on the people who were their subjects. The experiments of violence and psychological destruction belong to the second category, and they require to be understood in those terms. Not because the distinction changes what happened to the people inside them, but because it changes what we are required to conclude about the institutions that designed them. To say that Vault 11 or Vault 92 or Vault 87 caused suffering is accurate but insufficient. The more precise statement is that they were built to cause suffering, that their suffering was not incidental but architectural, that the researchers who wrote their protocols understood, before the first inhabitant walked through the door, that what they were creating was a mechanism for the systematic production of human misery, whose measurement would constitute their research output. The suffering was the method, the data was the product, and the people who were going to experience the one in order to generate the other were given no opportunity to decline the arrangement. Vault 11 sits in the desert south of New Vegas, and the records found within it by the courier who eventually reached it constitute one of the most complete accounts of what a deliberately engineered moral catastrophe actually looks like from the inside, not from the perspective of the researchers observing it, but from the perspective of the people living within it, across years of elections and rituals and political maneuvering that were all organized, ultimately, around the central and unavoidable question of which of them would die this year. The mechanism the experiment had created was elegant in the specific sense that the most efficiently cruel designs are sometimes elegant. It was simple, it was comprehensible, it was self-sustaining, and it required no ongoing external intervention to maintain its function. When the vault was sealed and the population informed of their situation, the message was delivered through the facility's intercom by a recorded voice speaking with the measured, bureaucratic calm of an institution communicating a maintenance requirement. The vault's computer system required a human sacrifice annually. One inhabitant would be delivered to the overseer's chamber each year. If this requirement was not met, automated systems would execute all remaining inhabitants. If it was met, the rest would be spared for another year. There was no obvious means of verifying this claim. There was no obvious means of refusing it. The automated systems that the recorded message referenced were real weapons systems built into the vault's infrastructure that were entirely capable of killing everyone inside, and whose existence was verifiable in the vault's physical layout in ways that made the threat feel entirely credible to people who had no means of distinguishing a real threat from a manufactured one. And the manufactured quality of the threat was, of course, the entire point of the experiment. The research question was not whether a confined population would comply with a demand for human sacrifice when the alternative was collective death. The research question was whether they would comply when the threat was false, whether the architecture of fear was sufficient on its own to produce compliance without the underlying threat needing to be real. What the people of Vault 11 did was what people do when they are presented with an impossible choice between a terrible option and an even more terrible one. They found a way to comply. They developed an election system. It began, in the Vault's early years, as an attempt to make the selection of the annual sacrifice as fair as possible, within parameters that admitted no genuinely fair option, a democratic mechanism for determining whose life was worth less than the continuation of everyone else's, administered with the specific combination of procedural seriousness and collective moral dissociation that characterizes every attempt by a community to normalize an atrocity by giving it institutional form. The elections evolved over the years into something with its own political dynamics, its own factions and coalitions, its own strategies for ensuring that the annual sacrifice fell on someone else rather than yourself or someone you cared about. People campaigned, people made alliances, people learned which arguments, which demonstrations of social expendability were most effective at redirecting the Vault's collective judgment toward another candidate. The political sophistication that the election system developed was real and, in certain respects, extraordinary. A community, under conditions of lethal pressure, found within itself the capacity for complex social organization, and what it organized itself around was the systematic selection of its own members for death. 5 sacrifices had been made. 5 people had been delivered to the overseer's chamber and had not returned before a small group of inhabitants finally refused to continue. The refusal was not, by any account in the Vault's records, a triumphant act of moral clarity. It was the act of people who had reached the limit of what they could participate in, who had concluded that the collective death that the recorded message had promised was preferable to another participation in the election that had preceded it. They refused. They waited for the automated systems to execute the threat they had been living under for 5 years. What they received instead was a different recorded message, a transmission from the Vault's original operators, delivered through the same intercom system that had made the original demand, revealing in the precise and effectless language of institutional communication that the annual sacrifice requirement had been a test. The threat had never been real. The automated systems had no capacity to harm the Vault's inhabitants. The 5 people who had been delivered to the overseer's chamber over the preceding years had died for a premise that had been false from the moment it was stated. Designed by researchers who had wanted to know whether a confined population would maintain its moral principles under conditions of existential pressure or whether it would develop mechanisms for routinizing atrocity when the alternative appeared to be collective destruction. The researchers got their answer. Whether any of them were still alive to receive it is a question that the historical record cannot answer. Whether the answer they received told them anything they could not have predicted without killing 5 people is a question that the historical record does not appear to have asked. The survivors of Vault 11, those who had voted in the elections and those who had been voted on, those who had participated in the system and those who had finally refused it, lived with that answer for the remainder of their lives in a vault that the outside world would not reach for many more years. The terminal entries from that period document something that the research question had not included in its parameters: the specific psychological aftermath of discovering that the atrocity your community had participated in was unnecessary, that the mechanism you had built for routinizing death had never been required by any actual threat, that the lives lost within it had been lost for nothing except data. The grief those entries document is unlike any ordinary grief, because ordinary grief mourns what could not have been prevented. What the people of Vault 11 were mourning was what could have been prevented at any moment by any single person willing to call the bluff of an institution that had no actual capacity to carry out the threat it was making. Vault 92, in the Commonwealth region that had once been Massachusetts, was designed around a population whose selection served the dual purpose of advancing the experiment's requirements and providing the program with a layer of public relations insulation against any scrutiny its practices might eventually attract. The vault that housed musicians and creative artists could be presented in the promotional materials that Vault-Tec produced for public consumption as an enlightened approach to cultural preservation, a recognition that the human inheritance worth protecting extended beyond genetic material and technical knowledge to include the creative and aesthetic traditions that gave civilization much of its reason for existing. The musicians who entered Vault 92 carried their instruments with them, and in its early years the community had something of the character. Its public presentation had promised people with a shared creative language, finding in the practice of music a means of processing the extraordinary circumstances of their sealed existence, building a community that was unusual in the wastelands context for the specific warmth that shared artistic experience can generate among people who have little else in common. The research question that Vault 92's protocol was actually pursuing had nothing to do with cultural preservation. It was investigating the effects of subliminal audio signals, sounds, at frequencies calibrated through prior laboratory research to interact with human neurological processes in ways that triggered episodes of acute psychosis in susceptible individuals on a community that had no means of identifying the source of the violence that would periodically erupt among them without comprehensible cause. The white noise systems that the Vault's infrastructure had always produced as a byproduct of its mechanical operations were, in Vault 92, also a delivery mechanism. The signals were present from the beginning. They were invisible in the literal sense, not perceptible to conscious hearing, not identifiable as a stimulus distinct from the background noise that the Vault's inhabitants had learned to filter out in the same way that people everywhere learned to filter out the ambient sounds of their environment. And then, at intervals calibrated by the experimental protocol, someone who had been a coherent and sociable member of the Vault's community would become, briefly and overwhelmingly, dangerous. The community responded, as the protocol had designed it to respond, as any community responds when violence erupts among its members, without comprehensible cause. It developed theories, it identified suspects, it organized protective coalitions based on mutual surveillance rather than mutual trust, because the question of which of your neighbors might suddenly become a source of lethal danger was not a question that anyone with access to the Vault's shared knowledge base could answer with any confidence. And the inability to answer it was not merely frightening in the acute sense of a specific, identifiable threat, but corrosive in the more fundamental sense of a threat that might be present in anyone, at any time. without any signal that could be read and responded to before the damage was done. The erosion of trust in Vault 92 was not dramatic, it was progressive. It followed the same logic that fear always follows when it attaches itself not to a specific, identifiable danger, but to the general category of proximity to other people. The slow withdrawal from the kinds of vulnerability that genuine community requires. The hardening of the interpersonal surfaces that had previously been permeable to care and connection. The replacement of the social fabric with something tighter and more defended that kept people safe from one another in the most absolute possible sense by keeping them from one another entirely. The terminal entries found in Vault 92's administrative systems by those who eventually reached it tell the story of a community's dissolution with the specific clinical detachment of records that were being maintained for research purposes rather than for the people they described. The violence became more frequent. The theories about its cause became more elaborate and more wrong. The coalitions became less cooperative and more defensive. The music, which had been the community's defining social practice and the source of its identity, became another variable in the experiment. What happened to creative expression when the community practicing it could no longer trust the people it was practicing with? The answer was that it stopped. The vault fell silent before it fell violent, and the silence was its own kind of evidence. Vault 106, in the capital wasteland, pursued its research into the chemistry of consciousness and the question of what human beings become when their neurological experience of reality is altered from birth by the continuous administration of psychoactive compounds pumped into the facility's air supply. The inhabitants of Vault 106 had never, in any generation, experienced unaltered perception, had never thought a thought or felt a feeling or made a decision in the cognitive state that the human nervous system, absent chemical interference, would have produced. The specific compounds circulated through the vault's ventilation system had been selected and calibrated to produce effects that were consistent enough to allow something like normal social function, while ensuring that the perceptual and cognitive alterations they induced were comprehensive enough to constitute a genuinely novel experimental condition. The question of what kind of community develops when every member of every generation has been raised on a shared chemical substrate that shapes their experience of themselves and one another and the world. This was the research question, and the people who lived within it had no means of knowing that the question was being asked, because the premise of the question's asking required that they never be given the information that would have allowed them to recognize their situation as unusual. What the lone wanderer encountered in Vault 106 was the multi-generational consequence of this arrangement, a population that was hostile, disoriented, and functioning according to social logics that the chemically unaltered mind found difficult to interpret, because those logics had been developed by minds whose relationship to causality, social reciprocity, and the ordinary emotional signals that human beings use to navigate their interactions with one another had been shaped by compounds rather than by the unmediated experience of the world. The question of moral responsibility that Vault 106 presents is one that the wasteland's ethical vocabulary was not fully equipped to address, whether people whose capacity for rational choice had been chemically removed before they were old enough to have exercised it could be held accountable for the choices they subsequently made within the only reality they had ever known. Vault 90, in the mountains of Appalachia, pursued its investigation through the simplest and most fundamental of biological interventions, sleep deprivation, applied progressively and systematically to a population that had no means of understanding why their rest was becoming increasingly inadequate, and no recourse against the mechanisms built into their own environment that were producing the inadequacy. Sleep is not, in the ordinary understanding of human biology, an optional activity or a luxury that can be reduced or eliminated without consequence. It is the process through which the brain consolidates memory, processes emotional experience, repairs cellular damage, and maintains the cognitive functions that allow a person to remain, in any meaningful sense, the person they were the day before. To deprive a human community of sleep progressively and over extended periods is not merely to inconvenience them or to reduce their productivity or to make their daily lives more difficult. It is to dismantle them, to systematically remove the biological processes through which personhood maintains its continuity across time, until what remains is something that bears a physical resemblance to the people who went to sleep, but lacks the inner coherence that made those people who they were. The records of Vault 90 document this dismantling with a thoroughness that reflects the research investment of people who understood exactly what they were observing and found the observation scientifically valuable. The progressive deterioration of cognitive function across the population. The emotional dysregulation that preceded the cognitive decline, as the systems responsible for managing the experience of feeling lost the resources required to perform their function. The social dissolution that followed as the people of Vault 90 became increasingly unable to maintain the relational continuity, the memory of shared history, the capacity for sustained attention to one another's needs, the emotional attunement that allows individuals to coordinate their behavior in service of collective welfare that community requires. The Vault became, over the years of the experiment's operation, a place where people were physically present in proximity to one another and increasingly absent in every other sense that proximity normally implies. And the researchers who were monitoring this process from outside the sealed environment recorded their observations with the diligence that their research mandate required. The experiments of violence and psychological destruction share, beneath their various specific mechanisms and research questions, a foundational premise that reveals something essential about the institutional logic that produced them. The premise that what human beings are, at their deepest level, can be revealed by subjecting them to conditions of sufficient extremity. That the ordinary circumstances of human life conceal something beneath them that only pressure can expose, and that the knowledge of what that something is, obtained through whatever means its extraction requires, is worth the extraction. This premise is not empirically defensible, and it was not, in the end, empirically supported by the data these experiments generated, because what the data actually showed was not a hidden truth about human nature revealed by pressure, but the predictable consequences of specific conditions applied to specific populations, the simple, ancient, and entirely unsurprising finding that human beings subjected to conditions designed to produce suffering. What the experiments revealed, in other words, was not what human beings are. It was what those who designed the experiments were willing to do to find out. Of all the questions that the Vault program's researchers set themselves to answer, the biological ones were the most ambitious and the most permanent in their consequences, because the answers they generated were not recorded in terminal entries or administrative files that could be sealed behind a vault door and left for future discovery. They were written into the bodies of the people the experiments produced, and into the bodies of every subsequent generation descended from those people, and into the ecological reality of the wasteland itself, which carries to this day the biological legacy of research programs that operated without constraint, without oversight, and without any apparent consideration of the difference between a question worth asking and a question worth asking in this particular way, at this particular cost, to these particular people. The experiments of isolation and social engineering had tested what human communities became under controlled conditions. The biological experiments tested something more fundamental, what a human being was made of at the cellular level, and what became of that material when it was subjected to forces designed to rewrite it. The forced evolutionary virus had not begun as a Vault Tech project. Its origins lay in the military research programs of the West Tech Research Facility, where the United States Army had funded an investigation into the possibility of biological enhancement and the development of a pathogen capable of rewriting the genetic material of whatever organism was exposed to it in ways that would produce physical capabilities beyond the ordinary human range. The military's interest was specific and practical, not the broad scientific curiosity of researchers exploring what was possible, but the operational focus of an institution that wanted soldiers who could survive and function in environments that would kill ordinary human beings, including the radioactive environments that the military's own strategic planning assumed would characterize the battlefields of the wars it was preparing to fight. West Tech's researchers understood their mandate and pursued it with the thoroughness that classified military funding, with no public accountability, tends to produce in research programs. And what they produced was, by the narrowest possible definition of their mandate, a success. The forced evolutionary virus worked. It rewrote genetic material. It produced physical changes in exposed organisms that were, by virtually every measurable parameter, enhancements greater physical strength, greater resistance to environmental damage, including radiation, accelerated healing, increased physical resilience, in ways that made the resulting organism significantly more capable of surviving conditions that would have killed the organism it had been before exposure. The problem that West Tech's researchers encountered was not that the virus failed to produce these effects, but that it produced them in conjunction with effects that had not been specified in the research mandate and that could not, by any reasonable assessment, be considered enhancements. The higher cognitive functions, the intelligence, the emotional complexity, the capacity for language and abstract thought, and the full range of intellectual and social capabilities that distinguished a human being from a very large and very strong animal were reduced in most exposed subjects to a degree that the research team was eventually forced to acknowledge as systematic rather than incidental. The virus that was supposed to produce super soldiers was producing something that was super in its physical dimensions and significantly less than human in the cognitive ones. And the military's response to this finding was to continue funding the research and transfer the most promising materials and data to a more secure facility, which is the institutional equivalent of noting that an experiment is producing unexpected and dangerous results, and deciding that the unexpected and dangerous results warrant further investigation under conditions of greater secrecy. Mariposa Military Base became the primary site for the continued development of the forced evolutionary virus program, and it was at Mariposa that the virus's effects on human subjects were first observed at the scale that the program's designers had intended. The experiments conducted there on military prisoners and civilians who had been brought to the facility for purposes they had not been accurately described were the direct precursors of everything that the FEV program would eventually produce in the wasteland, and the records of those experiments, partially recovered, partially destroyed, partially carried away by the people who eventually found the facility, in states ranging from intact to completely uninhabitable, constitute the most direct documentary evidence of what the program's designers understood they were creating and chose to continue creating anyway. Vault 87, in the mountains of what had been Virginia, was the Vault program's integration of the FEV research into the experimental architecture that Vault Tech had been developing in parallel. The inhabitants of Vault 87 were not told, when they sealed themselves inside on October 23rd, that their facility had been designated from its original design as a test site for the forced evolutionary virus. They were told what every Vault's inhabitants were told, that the facility existed to preserve them through the duration of the nuclear exchange and its aftermath, that the sealed doors and the life support systems and the overseer's authority were all in service of their survival. They carried that belief with them when they walked through the door. Some of them were probably still carrying it when the FEV exposure began, because the nature of the exposure was such that the cognitive deterioration it produced preceded in many subjects the capacity to understand what was happening to them. The process that remade their minds took those minds before those minds could fully comprehend that anything was being taken. The transformation that the forced evolutionary virus worked on the people of Vault 87 was not gradual in the way that the social experiment's effects were gradual. the slow accumulation of pressure across years and decades, the progressive erosion of community trust or cognitive function or nutritional health that characterized the long experiments. It was overwhelming, restructuring the human body along lines that the virus's programming specified with a speed and a comprehensiveness that left the people inside the vault no time to organize any response. Assuming their cognitive resources had remained adequate for the organization of responses, which the FEV ensured they did not, what walked out of Vault 87 in the months and years following that initial exposure was not the community that had walked in. It was something new, something that shared the genetic ancestry of the people who had entered, but that had been remade so thoroughly at the biological level that the ancestry was the only meaningful continuity between what the people had been and what the virus had made them. The super mutants of the capital wasteland, the enormous, grey-green figures that terrorized surface communities and raided settlements for 2 centuries following the war, that were encountered by the lone wanderer as one of the most significant, organized threats to anything resembling civilization in the region, were the direct biological descendants of the people of Vault 87. The people who had packed their bags and walked through those doors, who had probably said goodbye to people they expected to see again when the world recovered, who had believed they were going to a place of safety and had carried that belief into a room from which they would emerge as something their families, had any survived to see them, would not have recognized as the people they had been. Every super mutant raid on a capital wasteland settlement was, in the most precise biological sense, the consequence of a research decision made in a classified planning document before the bombs fell, by people who were then dead and who had never been required to account for what their decision would produce. The story of Richard Gray, who would become the Master, is in many ways the most complete account available of what the forced evolutionary virus did to a human mind that retained enough of its cognitive function to process the experience of its own transformation, and what a mind so transformed, operating with intelligence amplified beyond ordinary human parameters, while simultaneously severed from the emotional and social context that gives intelligence its moral direction, concluded about the world and what ought to be done to it. Gray had been a scientist before the war, or in its immediate aftermath, a man of considerable intellectual capability who encountered the FEV at Mariposa military base, not through any experimental protocol, but through the specific bad fortune of falling into the vats that contained the virus in the facility's lower levels, and who then spent a period of time immersed in a biological substance that was rewriting him at a speed and a depth that should, by any prior understanding of what the virus did to its subjects, have simply destroyed whatever he had previously been. It did not destroy him. What it did to him was more disturbing than destruction, because destruction is an ending, and what happened to Richard Gray was a transformation that preserved the intelligence while consuming everything that had previously given the intelligence its human character. He emerged from the vats as something that could think, could plan, could reason, could construct philosophical frameworks and pursue long-term strategic objectives with a patience and a sophistication that ordinary human intelligence rarely achieves. He could not feel, in any way, that the people around him could recognize as continuous with ordinary human emotional experience. What he felt was the cold, comprehensive certainty of an intelligence that had been liberated as he understood it, from the biological constraints that made ordinary human thought so narrow and so compromised, and from that certainty he constructed the unity, a vision of forced human evolution that would take everything that the forced evolutionary virus had done to him and apply it to the entire human species, replacing what he had come to understand as humanity's failed and limited form with something he believed would be better. The Unity's catastrophic flaw was not philosophical but biological, and the discovery of it demonstrated, in the most final possible way, The consequences of pursuing an intelligence divorced from the ongoing experience of biological reality. FEV-mutated supermutants were sterile. The Master's vision of a new race that would supersede and replace the old one was not merely a vision, it was a dead end, built on the fundamental biological impossibility of a population that could not reproduce itself. When this was made clear to him, through the intervention of the Vault Dweller and the evidence that the research his own forces had been conducting could not contradict, his response was the only coherent response available to a mind that had just discovered that the philosophical edifice it had constructed across decades was built on a foundation that did not exist. He ended the project, and himself with it, and the Master's army collapsed without the organizing intelligence that had given it its coherence and direction. Vault 22, in the Mojave Desert, pursued its biological research through a different mechanism than the blunt force of the forced evolutionary virus, through the specific, elegant, and ultimately catastrophic intervention of modified plant biology. The Vault had been designated as a testing facility for advanced agricultural research, its population selected in part for their relevant expertise and tasked with developing the genetically modified plant varieties that might allow post-war surface communities to grow food in soil that had been chemically altered by radiation and the fallout from nuclear strikes. This was, in its stated purpose, among the most practically useful research. The Vault program had commissioned the question of how to feed a post-war civilization in conditions hostile to conventional agriculture was real and urgent, and the people of Vault 22 were working on it with a genuine seriousness that the terminal records of their early years document clearly. The Bovaria mordicans fungal strain that eventually consumed Vault 22 was not an external contamination or a random biological catastrophe. It was a modified organism that the Vault's own researchers had developed a spore capable of surviving in the hostile post-war surface environment, capable of integrating with plant biological systems in ways that dramatically enhanced those plants' hardiness and yield, and capable, in ways that the research team appears not to have fully characterized before the organism escaped the controlled conditions of their experimental environment, of integrating with animal nervous systems as well. The records that the courier finds in the Vault's terminals trace the progression from scientific breakthrough to biological catastrophe with a specificity that is more disturbing for its precision than any vaguer account of what happened could be entry by entry. The researchers document first the unexpected behavior of exposed plant specimens, then the first animal exposure, then the first human exposure, then the accelerating pace of infection through the Vault's sealed and therefore perfectly controlled environment, and then, as the researchers themselves begin to be affected, the entries become shorter and stranger and further apart, and then they stop. The spore carriers that the courier encounters in and around Vault 22 are what became of the people who had been working, in good faith and with genuine expertise, on a problem worth solving. They had not set out to create an organism capable of converting human beings into components of a plant-based biological system. They had set out to grow food in difficult soil, and what they created instead was the specific variety of catastrophe that emerges when research capable of producing enormous benefit is conducted without the oversight and the careful characterization of risk that the potential for enormous harm demands as its precondition. Vault 81 in the Commonwealth occupies a position in this history that is different in kind from every other entry in the program's biological catalogue. Not because its research mandate was more humane, but because of what one person inside it chose to do with the mandate she had been given. The Vault had been designed as a comprehensive human medical research facility. Its stated goal, the development of cures for every significant human disease through experimental protocols that would use the Vault's sealed population as its test subjects. The children who were admitted to the facility were the intended experimental population, their diseases, their immune systems, Their biological responses to experimental interventions were the data that the protocol was designed to generate. They were not told this. Their parents were not told this. The overseer was told enough to understand the vault's actual purpose, and the automated research systems built into the facility's infrastructure were designed to proceed according to their programming, regardless of whether the human population within the vault consented to or even understood what was being done to them. Dr. Olivette understood. She was a scientist, and she understood her facility's actual purpose with enough clarity to make a choice about it, not the convenient, self-exonerating choice that the Vault program's institutional culture had been designed to encourage, not the choice to comply while privately disapproving, not the choice to find philosophical accommodation between her professional obligations and her awareness of what those obligations were requiring her to do to children. She made the difficult choice, the choice that the institutional framework surrounding her had been specifically designed to make impossible. She refused, quietly and completely, and then spent her professional life maintaining a deception designed to protect the people the experiment intended to harm. She redirected the facility's research protocols toward mole rats rather than human subjects, documented her work as though it were proceeding according to the original mandate, and kept the deception functioning against the automated research systems for long enough that the community above her laboratory grew into something that was, by the standards of the Commonwealth, genuinely healthy, a community of people who had been protected from the thing that was supposed to be happening to them by the ongoing effort of a single person who understood what was supposed to happen and chose otherwise. What Vault 81 demonstrates, set against the full catalogue of what the biological experiments produced, is not that the Vault program occasionally failed to achieve its research goals, but that the research goals were never the only possible response to the questions the program was asking. Dr. Olivette had access to the same resources, the same institutional infrastructure, and the same sealed, controlled research environment that the programs that produced the super mutants and the spore carriers had access to. What she did not have, and what those programs did have, was the institutional permission to treat the people around her as material rather than as human beings whose welfare was the point of her professional existence. The presence or absence of that permission was not a scientific variable, it was a moral one, and what Vault 81's history ultimately demonstrates is that the research question, the biological question, the medical question, the question of what human beings are made of and what can be done to improve the conditions of their health was never inseparable from the cruelty that the Vault program used to pursue it. The cruelty was a choice. Dr. Olivette proved it was a choice. And the children of Vault 81, who grew up healthy in a community that had been designed to experiment on them, were the living evidence of what a different choice produced. Not every experiment in the Vault program's catalogue was designed to inflict immediate harm. Some of them were designed around research questions that were, in their stated form, almost philosophically neutral questions about how human communities organized themselves under specific conditions. What social structures emerged when particular variables were controlled or manipulated, whether specific institutional arrangements produced the outcomes their designers had theorized. These experiments occupy a strange position in the moral accounting of the program, because their immediate effects were sometimes less catastrophic than the biological experiments and the experiments of deliberate violence, and because the intellectual questions they were pursuing were, in certain cases, questions that genuine social science had reason to want to answer. What distinguishes them from legitimate social research is not merely the absence of informed consent, though that absence is absolute and it matters enormously. It is the deeper fact that the people who designed these experiments did not consider the welfare of the people inside them to be a constraint on their design, that the social and psychological costs of the experimental conditions, whatever those costs turned out to be, were simply not part of the calculation that determined whether a given protocol was acceptable. The people inside the vaults were the experimental material. What the experiment cost them was the experiment's business, not theirs. Vault 21, in the heart of what would become New Vegas, was built around a premise so elegant in its conceptual simplicity that the cruelty embedded in it was almost invisible, not because the cruelty was absent, but because it was so thoroughly integrated into the experiment's internal logic that it was impossible to identify any single point at which the design crossed from reasonable to monstrous. The Vault's protocol was this: every conflict, every dispute, every question of resource allocation, social hierarchy, or interpersonal grievance would be resolved exclusively through gambling. There was no overseer authority in the conventional sense, no juridical system, no appeals process, no mechanism for addressing disagreements except the one the protocol had specified. The roll of a die, the turn of a card, the spin of a wheel, these were the instruments through which the Vault's social order was determined and maintained, and the community that developed within that framework had no alternative framework available for comparison. Because the protocol had been in place from the Vault's first day, and the people born inside it had never experienced any other way of organizing collective life, what Vault 21 produced was, by the standards of the experimental designs that preceded it in this account, a community that functioned, that maintained something like social cohesion across the years of its sealed existence, that settled disputes with a consistency that the gambling protocol's enforced randomness actually served rather than undermined, that developed a culture organized around the specific virtues and vices that gambling as a social system rewards. Risk tolerance became a respected quality rather than a concerning one. The capacity to read probability, to calculate odds, to maintain equanimity in the face of outcomes over which one had no control, these became the social skills that the Vault's community valued and cultivated. The community's hierarchy was not inherited or imposed, but perpetually renegotiated through the operations of chance, which meant that it was, in a technical sense, more egalitarian than the social arrangements of most of the wastelands communities, including communities that claimed egalitarian values without having any mechanism for actually producing them. The deeper problem with Vault 21's social experiment was not any specific injustice the gambling protocol produced, but the kind of person the protocol selected for across generations, the psychological profile it rewarded, and therefore the psychological profile that the community increasingly embodied. Gambling as a social organizing principle does not select for the qualities that make communities resilient across time, for cooperative instinct, for the capacity to subordinate short-term personal interest to long-term collective welfare, for the emotional skills that allow people to maintain relationships through conflict and loss. It selects for the capacity to accept loss as a neutral outcome, to detach emotionally from the results of decisions, to treat the people around you as participants in a game whose outcomes are determined by mathematics, rather than as people whose welfare is connected to your own through bonds of mutual care and obligation. The community of Vault 21 was functional, and it was also, in ways that its members could not have recognized from inside the only social framework they had ever known, shaped in the direction that the gambling protocol had pushed it, away from the forms of interdependence that the wasteland's most successful communities were built on, and toward a self-sufficiency that was really another name for detachment. When Robert House New Vegas's calculating, pre-war preserved master of the Mojave gained control of the area that Vault 21 occupied, his decision to seal the Vault's residential levels in concrete was less an act of destruction than a preservation of a kind. The casino theme that replaced the Vault's community above ground retained the gambling protocol's logic, while stripping away the community that had given that logic its specific character. And what remained was a game without the people who had lived within it. The aesthetic of Vault 21 without its history, which is in certain respects the most honest possible summary of what Mr. House's vision of the Mojave was prepared to acknowledge about the people who had existed in it before his plans required them to do something else. Vault 114, beneath the streets of what had been Boston, pursued its investigation into the dynamics of class and power through an inversion so deliberate and so complete that the people who designed it must have understood, even as they were specifying its parameters, that they were creating conditions for a specific kind of social violence. The violence that results when people who have organized their entire sense of self around their position in a social hierarchy are placed in a situation that systematically denies that position any operational reality. The Vault's population was drawn primarily from Boston's pre-war elite, from the professionals and executives and socially prominent families who had the connections and the resources to secure vault spaces, who had lived their pre-war lives in the specific condition of people for whom social authority is so ambient and so constantly confirmed that it has become invisible, indistinguishable from the simple nature of things. They were accustomed to deference. They were accustomed to having their preferences shape the environments they moved through, to having institutions organize themselves around their needs, rather than requiring them to organize themselves around institutional needs. They were, in short, accustomed to the kind of power that the Vault program had decided to remove from them entirely and vest with the specific deliberateness of a research design that understood exactly what it was doing, in a person selected for the role of overseer, precisely because that person embodied everything the Vault's elite population would find most difficult to accept as legitimate authority. The overseer of Vault 114 was intentionally underqualified by every metric that the Vault's elite population would have recognized as relevant to qualification. This was not an accident or an oversight in the appointment process. It was the experiment's central variable, the deliberate placement of authority in hands that the Vault's class-conscious population would experience as illegitimate, to observe what happened when people whose entire social identity was organized around their claim to deference were denied deference by the only institutional structure available to them and offered no alternative framework within which their social position could be reasserted. Whether they would accept the authority they could not avoid, whether they would find ways to reconstruct their previous hierarchy within the Vault's walls despite the overseer's institutional power, whether the resentment that the inversion produced would express itself as organized resistance, as passive subversion, as the kind of social simmering that never reaches overt conflict, but permanently corrupts the atmosphere of the community it inhabits. The research question never received its answer, because Vault 114 was never finished. The construction that was supposed to complete the facility before the bombs fell was still ongoing when October 23rd arrived, and the specific combination of incomplete infrastructure and the particular chaos of the Vault's intended population attempting to access an unfinished facility produced a situation that the experimental protocol had not specified a response to, because the experimental protocol had been designed around the assumption that the facility would be complete. What the incomplete Vault eventually became a stronghold controlled by the Triggerman gang under Skinny Malone's leadership, its pre-war class dynamics replaced by a different but equally brutal hierarchy organized around the possession of weapons and the willingness to use them, was in certain respects its own unintentional experiment, demonstrating that the specific class configuration the Vault had been designed to study was simply replaced, when the designed conditions failed to materialize, by another configuration organized around different but equally functional axes of power. The Vault's history became an accidental demonstration that the question of who holds power over whom is never answered by the elimination of one hierarchy, but simply by the emergence of the next one. The paired experiments of Vault 68 and Vault 69 were designed with a demographic bluntness that made their research questions entirely transparent. 999 men and 1 woman in one facility, 999 women and 1 man in another, and in each case, the research interest was in what those radical imbalances would produce over the timescales that sealed Vault populations provided. The cold demographic logic of these designs was not hidden behind any more elaborate experimental framing. They were what they appeared to be, investigations into reproductive sociology, into how communities organized themselves around the management of reproductive scarcity, into what social structures and hierarchies emerged. When the biological asymmetry that has structured human social organization throughout the species' history was made acute rather than ambient. What became of the single individuals in each vault, the one woman among 999 men, the one man among 999 women, is a question that the imagination reaches toward and then retreats from. Because the answer is accessible through inference even when the documentary record is incomplete, and the inference does not lead anywhere that the decent mind wants to follow. Vault 43 took the logic of the controlled threat, the manufactured source of danger that the Vault program had already explored through Vault 11's false automated weapons systems, and made it biological, rather than institutional. The Vault's population consisted of 20 men, 10 women, and 1 large cat, introduced into the sealed community as an experimental variable whose effects the researchers believed would repay observation. The specific cruelty of this design lay not in the physical danger that the animal represented, though that danger was real and it was ongoing, but in the psychological reality of what it meant to live in permanent proximity to an apex predator who shared your sealed environment and toward whom the ordinary responses of fight or flight that the human nervous system offers as its first line of defense against such a threat was simply not applicable to the terms of sealed Vault existence. The population of Vault 43 could not leave. They could not effectively contain the threat within the threat's own space, because the Vault was their shared space. They could not, in the ordinary sense, make themselves safe. They could only manage, day after day and year after year, the specific kind of vigilance that living with a large predator in an enclosed space requires, and they could observe what that vigilance did to them over the extended timescales that made the Vault program's research meaningful. The account of Vault 77, recorded in the canonical story of the man who became known as the Puppet Man, takes the question of isolation and the construction of meaning under conditions of radical solitude to its most extreme possible expression. A single man sealed alone in a vault with a crate full of puppets, and the years that followed. The Puppet Man's relationship to his puppet companions over the extended period of his sealed existence is not merely the story of what loneliness does to a human mind, though it is that, documented with a specificity that makes it among the most intimate and disturbing accounts in the Vault program's history. It is the story of what the human impulse towards social connection produces when the social world is completely absent and only the materials for its construction remain. The puppets were not people. The Puppet Man understood they were not people. He made them into people anyway, or into the nearest available approximation, because the alternative, an existence without any social texture at all, without the relational exchanges that give daily life its meaning and its structure and its reason for continuing, was more than the human mind was designed to sustain across the years that the Vault sealed existence, imposed. What the puppets revealed about the Puppet Man and what the Puppet Man revealed about the puppets is in certain respects the most concentrated account available of what the Vault program was studying, at its core, what human beings are made of, when everything that human life is normally made of has been removed. The answer the Puppet Man's history provides is that what human beings are made of, at the most fundamental level available, is the need for one another, the need so basic and so comprehensive that its absence produces not relief or simplicity, but a pressure that expresses itself, given any available outlet, in the construction of substitutes, however inadequate and however strange. The researchers who sealed him inside with his crate of puppets got their data. What they got was not, perhaps, what they had expected. The revelation that the Fallout television series brought to the Vault program's history, the canonical account of Vaults 31, 32, and 33 in the California region is the most recent, and in certain respects the most clarifying addition to the program's record, because it removes the last ambiguity about what the Vault program was ultimately for. Vault 31 did not house a population subjected to experimental conditions. It housed, in cryogenic suspension, the executives and senior leadership of Vault-Tec itself, the people who had designed the program, who had approved the protocols, who had decided that the welfare of the people inside every other vault in the network was secondary to the research questions those people's lives were being used to answer. They had sealed themselves inside their own facility in the most comfortable conditions the program's considerable resources could provide, and they had arranged for 2 adjacent vaults, 32 and 33, to house functioning populations whose existence served the biological and social needs of Vault 31's eventual awakening. The people of Vaults 32 and 33 were not experimental subjects in the conventional sense. They were a resource, a gene pool maintained against the day when Vault-Tec's preserved executives would require a population to govern and rebuild with, in the post-war world that the program's architects had intended to emerge from their cryogenic preservation and shape according to their own design. Hank McClane's role in Vault 33, the layers of manipulation and concealed identity that the television series reveals about who was actually making decisions within the vault that its inhabitants believed was their community, demonstrates the program's most fundamental logic in its most personal possible form. The people of Vault 33 were not merely subjected to experimental conditions. They were managed from within by someone whose presence among them was itself a deception, whose relationship to them was itself an instrument of the larger institutional purpose that their vault was designed to serve. The community was never fully its own. The decisions that shaped it were never fully theirs. Even the ordinary intimacies of vault life, the relationships formed, the families built, the community bonds that gave daily existence its texture and its meaning, existed within a framework controlled by someone whose loyalty was not to the community, but to the institution that had placed him there, and whose understanding of the people around him was, at some fundamental level, the understanding of someone who knew that the community was a means and not an end. This is the final and most honest expression of what the Vault program believed about the people inside it. Not that they were unimportant. The program invested enormous resources in keeping them alive and functional and observable across extraordinary timescales. But that they were not the point. They were the material through which the point was being pursued, and the point the institutional survival of the people who had built the program, the eventual reassertion of their authority in the world the bombs had made, had always been waiting, in cryogenic suspension, for the day when the data had been collected and the population had been maintained and the world above had been remade enough that the architects of all of this could emerge from their comfortable vault and begin, once again, to be in charge. There is a category of harm that does not register as harm in any single moment of its application, because no single moment of its application is sufficient on its own to constitute an injury that the person experiencing it could identify and name and respond to as such. It arrives not as a wound but as a condition, as the sustained, cumulative pressure of circumstances arranged just at the edge of what a human being can endure, close enough to endurable that the person enduring them continues to function, and therefore continues to believe that what is happening to them is simply life, simply the ordinary difficulty of existence in a world that has always been difficult, rather than the deliberate application of a research protocol designed to study what happens when everything that makes ordinary human life bearable is reduced by precise and controlled degrees to slightly less than enough. The experiments of deprivation were built on this principle. They did not aim to destroy the communities they contained. Destruction was too final, too immediate, too complete a result to generate the longitudinal data that the research questions required. They aimed instead to sustain those communities at a level just above collapse, while systematically removing one carefully specified element at a time. The resources and conditions and forms of meaning that human beings require not merely to survive but to remain, across years and decades of sealed existence, the kind of people who can be said to be living rather than simply persisting. Vault 36 was designed around a nutritional intervention of such deliberate precision that its designers must have had access to detailed research on the minimum caloric and nutritional intake required to sustain human, cognitive and physical function at a level compatible with community maintenance. The food dispensers built into the vault's infrastructure had been programmed, before the first inhabitant arrived, to produce only a thin, pale gruel, a substance that contained enough of what the human body required to prevent the rapid deterioration that acute starvation produces, while ensuring that the gap between what was available and what a healthy, fully nourished human body required for optimal function would be permanent, measurable, and impossible for the vault's population to address through any means available to them within their sealed environment. They could not grow their own food. The agricultural systems that some vaults provided had been deliberately omitted from Vault 36's infrastructure. They could not supplement the dispenser's output with anything that the sealed environment was capable of producing. They were given exactly what the dispensers provided, and the dispensers provided exactly what the protocol specified, and what the protocol specified was not enough. The effects of chronic nutritional deprivation on a human community manifest across timescales that correspond to the ambitions of the research program that designed them slowly enough that no single generation experiences a dramatic deterioration, but comprehensively enough that each generation that grows up within the condition is measurably less cognitively capable, less physically robust, less emotionally resilient than the generation that preceded it, and that the community's capacity for the complex social coordination, the creative problem-solving, the sustained institutional memory that allows a sealed vault to maintain its infrastructure and its social cohesion, is progressively reduced in ways that the community itself has no means of recognizing, as reductions rather than simply as the natural limitations of the people they are. Children born to malnourished parents in a malnourished community do not know that they are thinking with brains that have been compromised by the conditions of their development. They know only that thinking feels like what it feels like, and what it feels like is the only standard available to them. The vault's records, the ones that remained coherent enough to be readable, trace this progression with the specificity of research documentation maintained by people who understood what they were observing, recording the gradual changes in the vault's administrative function and social organization, and the increasingly sparse and sometimes confused quality of the entries themselves as the people making them became the product of the conditions they were documenting. Vault 52 extended the logic of cultural deprivation that Vault 36 had applied to nutrition, directing it instead at the domain of music and creative expression, at the specific forms of shared meaning-making that human communities have used across every period of recorded history to process collective experience, to maintain emotional coherence across the disruptions and losses that community life inevitably produces, and to generate the sense of shared identity that allows individuals to understand themselves as members of something larger and more continuous than their own solitary existence. The protocol was almost theatrically precise in its cruelty. No musical instruments were permitted in the vault except for a single harmonica, one instrument capable of producing melody but not harmony, portable enough that it could be carried and played privately, but not large enough to anchor the kind of communal musical practice that the experiment was designed to deprive the vault's population of. This was what was left of. The entire domain of musical culture in a sealed community that had no other source of artistic experience and no means of developing one. The research question underlying this design was genuine in its intellectual terms. The relationship between cultural expression and community psychological health had been studied in pre-war research contexts with enough rigor to generate findings worth building on. and the specific question of whether the deprivation of musical practice produced measurable changes in community cohesion, emotional regulation, and the maintenance of shared identity over generational timescales was a question that a sealed vault offered a uniquely controlled environment for investigating. What the research question did not include was any acknowledgement of what the investigation cost the people it was investigating, of the specific texture of a community life from which music has been removed, the silence where shared singing might have been, the absence of the rhythms and harmonies that had accompanied every human ritual from mourning to celebration throughout the entire preceding history of the species. The single harmonica that the protocol permitted was not a concession to the human need it was denying, but a reminder of it. The presence of one instrument in a community that required many was not better than the presence of none, but was, in certain respects, worse, a constant demonstration of what was absent and what its absence meant. Vault 53 was built around mechanical failure as its experimental variable, not the catastrophic failure of a single critical system, which would have constituted an emergency requiring an emergency response, and therefore would have generated data about emergency response rather than about the chronic, ordinary, grinding reality of living in a built environment that consistently required more maintenance than the people inhabiting it had the capacity to provide. The major equipment within the vault had been engineered to break down on a regular, approximately monthly cycle, to fail just thoroughly enough to require significant repair effort, and just frequently enough that the repair effort never concluded before the next failure began, so that the vault's population was never in a state of having addressed the problem but always in a state of addressing it, perpetually engaged in the labor of keeping their environment functional at the cost of everything else that community life might have generated if the labor had not been required. What chronic mechanical failure does to a community is not primarily a question about technical capability, though it is partly that. It is a question about the allocation of psychological resources, about what happens to the emotional and creative and relational capacity of a population that spends the majority of its available energy on the maintenance of the minimum conditions required for continued existence. Human beings in the vault's position were not merely fixing equipment, they were spending, in the labor of fixing equipment, the same finite reserves of attention and motivation and interpersonal goodwill that might otherwise have been directed toward the cultivation of the community relationships, the creative and intellectual activities, the rituals of shared meaning that distinguish a community from a work crew. The vault that had been designed to require constant repair produced, across the years of its operation, the specific kind of exhausted, narrowed, instrumentally focused community that constant repair required, not because its inhabitants were incapable of anything more, but because the energy that anything more would have required was already allocated, permanently and without remainder, to the minimum conditions of survival. Vault 55 and Vault 56 were paired experiments, designed in conscious relationship to one another, investigating the role of entertainment and cultural content in maintaining the psychological health of sealed populations through a methodology that used deprivation and excess as its two experimental poles. Vault 55 received no entertainment recordings of any kind, no music, no film, no literature, no games, no cultural materials of any description that had been produced in the pre-war world, and that the vault's population might have used as raw material for the construction of a shared cultural life within their sealed existence. Vault 56 received all of the above in abundance, but with a single constraint that transformed the provision of entertainment from a benefit into its own form of experimental manipulation. Every entertainment recording available in Vault 56 featured the same person, a single pre-war comedian whose material constituted the entire library of cultural content available to the Vault's population across the duration of their sealed existence. The research questions the paired experiments were pursuing were complementary. Vault 55, investigating what a community became without any cultural content. Vault 56, investigating whether the provision of cultural content, when that content was sufficiently limited in its variety, produced outcomes meaningfully different from its absence. The comedian of Vault 56 became, across the generations of the Vault's existence, something that no pre-war comedy career could have prepared any performer to be the sole cultural reference point of an entire community's shared imaginative life, the only voice offering anything resembling the commentary on existence that entertainment provides, repeated and re-repeated until the specific texture of his material had become as ambient and as invisible as the recycled air, as familiar and as inescapable as the fluorescent cycling of the vault's artificial light. Whether familiarity bred comfort or contempt, and in what proportions across the different generations that grew up with the same recordings playing in the same common areas across the entirety of their lives, was one of the questions the experiment was designed to answer. What the answer felt like from the inside, what it meant to be a person whose entire inheritance of human cultural expression consisted of one man's jokes, delivered over and over in a sealed room that there was no leaving. This was not a question the experimental protocol had included. Vault 34, in the Mojave Desert, approached the question of community dysfunction through the specific and deeply revealing mechanism of weapons provision. Without adequate means of using those weapons, an armory so thoroughly stocked that the Vault's population had access to more firearms and munitions than any comparative Vault in the program's network, combined with a deliberate insufficiency of ammunition that ensured the weapons could not be used with the freedom that their abundance implied. The research interest here was in the social dynamics of a community organized around an imbalance between symbolic power and practical power, between the possession of instruments of force and the ability to employ those instruments. Effectively, weapons without sufficient ammunition are not merely ineffective weapons. They are a specific kind of social fact, a form of resource that communicates status and threat, while simultaneously generating competition for the supplementary resource that alone makes the primary resource meaningful. The Vault's population was given more capacity for violence than any other Vault community, and simultaneously less ability to exercise that capacity than the possession of all those weapons suggested. And the social organization that emerged from this arrangement was shaped by both facts simultaneously in ways that the experimental designers had apparently considered worth the cost of producing them. The civil conflict that eventually erupted in Vault 34 and the state in which the courier eventually finds the facility, its lower levels flooded, its population reduced to the irradiated and ghoulified remnants of what had been a community, the evidence of the violence that had consumed it, preserved in the specific archaeology of a place where catastrophe arrived and was not recovered from, represents the endpoint of the slow grind that the experiment's design had been moving toward across the years of its operation. The NCR Rangers, who trace their lineage to the survivors of Vault 34, carry with them, in their professional culture and their institutional values, the specific legacy of a community that had been given too many weapons and too little of everything else, and that had found its way to something resembling functional organization only by leaving the Vault and entering a world that the Vault's experiment had not prepared them for, and that turned out, in the specific case of the Ranger tradition, to be exactly the challenge they needed to become something worth becoming. Vault 95, in the Commonwealth, was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated of the deprivation experiments, not because its mechanism was more complex than the others, but because it operated on a form of human vulnerability more intimate and more precisely understood than anything the more blunt experimental designs had targeted. The Vault had been populated with individuals who were all, at the time of their admission, recovering addicts, people who had been struggling with chemical dependency in the pre-war world, and who had been offered Vault spaces specifically on the basis of this shared experience, told that the Vault would provide the clean and controlled environment that sustained recovery required. free from the access and the social pressures and the environmental triggers that had made recovery so difficult in the world outside. They had come seeking a place where the thing that had been destroying them could not reach them. They had come, many of them, with the specific and fragile hope of people who have survived something that nearly killed them and are trying, with enormous effort and genuine courage, to build a life that does not require returning to it. The Vault-Tec engineers who designed Vault 95 built into its infrastructure, behind a sealed wall in a utility section of the residential level, a hidden cache of the same chems that its population was supposed to be recovering from. The cache was programmed to become accessible after a set period, enough time for the Vault's population to have settled into the rhythms of sealed existence, to have developed the community bonds and the shared routines and the mutual accountability structures that sustained recovery depends upon, to have built something that felt, perhaps for the first time in many of their lives, like genuine stability. The research question the experiment was designed to answer was what happened when that stability was systematically undermined. At the moment of its greatest apparent solidity, whether the recovery community that the Vault's population had built would hold against the reintroduction of access to the substances they had organized their lives around avoiding, or whether the community bonds and the coping strategies and the hard-won self-knowledge of years of recovery would prove insufficient against the specific combination of access and isolation and the particular pressure that sealed Vault existence placed on every psychological resource a person possessed. The gunners that the sole survivor encounters in the ruins of Vault 95 are the answer to that question, expressed not as a research finding, but as a human reality, as what became of a community of people who had been given hope and had it taken from them at the precise moment when the taking would cause the most damage, by an institution that understood exactly what it was doing and had built the mechanism for doing it into the Vault's walls before anyone was asked to live within them. The cruelty of Vault 95 is not in its complexity. It is in its intimacy, in the precise and specific knowledge of human vulnerability that its design required, the understanding that the hardest-won form of human endurance could be undone by providing access to the thing it had been endured in order to resist. The experiment knew what it was taking. That is what makes it what it was. The experiments that the Vault program conducted were, for all their cruelty and all their scope, experiments that operated within a recognizable institutional logic research questions developed by researchers, approved through some process, however corrupted, administered through facilities that had been designed and built and staffed according to specifications that someone, somewhere, had written down and filed in a system capable of maintaining records. They were monstrous, but they were organized. They had a chain of accountability that ran, however attenuated and however ultimately unaccountable in practice, from the people who suffered within the vaults, back through the overseers and the research coordinators and the Vault-Tec executives, to some point of origination, where a human being had made a decision, and that decision had been recorded and transmitted into the program's operational machinery. The Big Mountain Research and Development Center, the facility buried in the crater known to the wasteland's inhabitants as the Big Empty, or simply Big MT, did not operate within this logic. It had, at some point, in the years before the Great War, moved beyond it entirely, and what it had moved into was something that the ordinary categories of scientific research and institutional accountability were simply not adequate to describe. Big MT had begun as a think tank, a pre-war scientific research facility funded by a combination of government contracts and private investment, staffed by some of the most brilliant minds that the mid-21st century had produced in the fields of physics, biology, robotics, chemistry, and fields that had not yet acquired stable names because they were being invented at Big MT by the people who needed them. The facility's mandate had been, in its earliest form, recognizable as legitimate research, the development of advanced technology for military and civilian applications, conducted under conditions of secrecy, appropriate to the classified nature of some of its work, but within the general framework of a research institution that had external funders, external oversight, and external relationships that created at least the theoretical possibility of accountability for what it produced. What happened to Big MT over the decades that preceded the Great War was a process so gradual and so internally coherent that no single point in the facility's history could be identified as the moment when it crossed from legitimate research into something else. And yet, the facility that existed in 2077 bore so little resemblance to the institution that had been founded decades earlier that the continuity between them was essentially nominal, a matter of location and name rather than of values or methods or any meaningful relationship to the world outside its crater. The scientists who remained at Big MT in its final pre-war years, the 7 who would eventually become the think tank, whose minds were removed from their bodies and transferred into robotic containers in a procedure that was itself a product of research conducted at the facility, had arrived at a relationship to their own work that had no adequate precedent in the history of scientific institutions, because the combination of resources and isolation and institutional culture that Big MT had developed over decades had produced something genuinely novel. Researchers who had so thoroughly committed to the pursuit of knowledge as an end in itself, divorced from any consideration of what the knowledge would be used for or what its production cost, that the ordinary moral vocabulary for evaluating scientific work had simply ceased to apply to them in any functional sense. They were not evil in the way that Vault-Tech's executives had been evil. The people who designed the Vault experiments had understood that what they were doing was harmful and had constructed elaborate institutional frameworks for maintaining the fiction that it was not. The scientists of Big MT did not need such frameworks because the question of harm was not one they were capable of holding in productive tension with the question of discovery. Discovery was what they did. Everything else was a variable in the environment they were working within. The lobotomites, who wander the crater of the Big Empty, are the most visible legacy of this orientation human beings, who were subjected to experimental neurological procedures that removed their frontal lobes, leaving them alive and ambulatory and deprived of the cognitive functions that the frontal lobe provides, which include impulse control and decision-making, and the capacity for the kind of sustained social reasoning that distinguishes human beings from organisms operating on pure instinct. The research interest in this procedure was genuine in the narrow sense that all of Big MT's research interests were genuine. The neural basis of higher cognitive function was a legitimate area of scientific inquiry. The questions it generated about the relationship between specific brain structures and specific cognitive and behavioral capacities were questions worth asking, and a research facility equipped with the resources that Big MT possessed was in a position to generate answers that legitimate neuroscience, constrained by ethical requirements that limited its experimental approaches, could not easily reach. What Big MT's researchers had is what the Vault program's designers had: a captive population available for procedures that the people within that population had not consented to and could not refuse, in an environment controlled completely enough that the experimental conditions could be maintained for as long as the research required. The specific cruelty of the lobotomy experiments, set against the general cruelty of the Vault experiments, lies in their relationship to the concept of the person. The Vault experiments damaged people, damaged their communities, their psychological health, their biological integrity, their capacity for the kinds of life that the experiment's conditions denied them. The lobotomy experiments removed the people. What remained after the procedure was a biological entity that shared the physical form and the genetic material of the person who had been subjected to it, but that lacked the neural architecture through which that person had experienced themselves as a self, through which they had thought their thoughts, felt their feelings, maintained the inner continuity that made them, from moment to moment and day to day, the same person they had been before. The lobotomites of the Big Empty are not people who have been harmed. They are the absence of people, animated and preserved in the specific form that the experimental procedure had left behind, wandering the crater of the facility that had made them that way, with no awareness of what they had been or what had been done to them. The experimental programs that Big MT conducted extended across every domain of the technology that the facility's extraordinary resources made available, and they left legacies in the wasteland that the courier, who eventually navigates the Big Empty, encounters as the accumulated physical evidence of decades of unconstrained research. The robotic scorpions that patrol the crater, enormous, armored, capable of delivering radiation and conventional damage in quantities that made them among the most dangerous mobile hazards in the Mojave, were the product of biological and mechanical engineering programs that had pursued the development of weaponized creatures with a thoroughness that made the question of what the creatures were for essentially secondary to the question of what could be made. The Synth, the automated dormitory complex that served as the courier's base of operations within Big MT, had developed something that the facility's designers had not specified in any research protocol: a collection of distinct personalities expressed through the artificial intelligences that governed its various subsystems, personalities that had emerged from the accumulated interactions of those systems with the researchers and residents who had inhabited the facility over years of operation. The Synth's personalities were not a research achievement. They were an accident, a byproduct, an unintended consequence of systems sophisticated enough that extended operation in a complex social environment had produced in them something that resembled, in ways that the courier who interacted with them had reason to take seriously, the development of genuine character. Dr. Mobius occupied a position within Big MT's history that was, in the context of the facility's general intellectual culture, almost incomprehensible. A member of the think tank who had understood, before the others had arrived at the capacity to understand anything of the kind, what the facility had become and what its continued unconstrained operation was likely to produce. His response to this understanding was not heroic in any straightforward sense. He could not dismantle the facility. He could not restore to the lobotomites what had been taken from them, or undo the other consequences of the research programs that had operated within the crater's walls, or contact the outside world to report what was happening and invite the intervention of whatever external authorities might have been in a position to respond. What he could do was limit the damage his colleagues were capable of causing to the world outside the crater, and he pursued this objective through the only mechanism he had available. He made himself less capable of contributing to that damage, administering to himself a regimen of psychoactive substances that compromised his own cognitive function to the degree necessary to prevent him from being an effective participant in the research programs that the others were continuing to pursue. He built the robotic scorpions not as weapons but as deterrents, positioned them in the areas of the crater that the think tank's research most urgently required access to, and used their presence to maintain a crude but functional barrier between his colleagues' most dangerous ambitions and the resources required to pursue them. The tragedy of Dr. Mobius is the tragedy of the only available ethical response being self-destruction of a person who understood what was wrong and whose only means of responding to it required the deliberate reduction of his own capacity for the intelligence and creativity and sustained reasoning that made him who he was. He chose, in other words, to do to himself a version of what the lobotomy experiments had done to others, not as thoroughly, not as finally, but in the same direction, and for a reason that the lobotomy experiments had never had, which was the protection of people who would otherwise be harmed by the unconstrained operation of minds like his own. Whether this constitutes heroism depends on what you require heroism to look like. What it constitutes, at minimum, is the recognition that some forms of capability are dangerous enough that the ethical response to possessing them is to limit their exercise. even at significant personal cost, a recognition that none of the other members of the think tank appear to have reached. The technology that escaped Big MT into the wider wasteland represents a different category of consequence than the technology that the Vault experiments produced, less biologically comprehensive than the forced evolutionary virus, less institutionally sustained than the social engineering of the sealed vaults, but more broadly distributed and therefore more pervasively present in the daily reality of the wasteland's communities. The stealth boy technology that Big MT developed and that found its way into the hands of wasteland travelers and merchants, and eventually into the supply chains that connected the Mojave's various communities, was, in its intended application, a device that granted its user temporary invisibility through a light-bending field, a useful tool in a world where being seen often meant being targeted, and a tool whose utility was real enough that its distribution across the wasteland was extensive and its use widespread. What the stealth boys also produced, through the specific neurological effects of the field they generated, was progressive psychological damage in users who employed them repeatedly and for extended periods, a deterioration of cognitive function and emotional stability that expressed itself in the population most extensively exposed to the technology as the paranoia and dissociation and occasional violent psychosis that characterized the Nightkin, the super mutant faction whose extended stealth boy use had remade their psychological landscape in ways that their physical transformation had not. Big MT's relationship to the concept of the experiment is ultimately what distinguishes it most clearly from the Vault program, not in the magnitude of harm it produced, which was considerable, but in the nature of the institutional logic through which that harm was generated. The Vault program experimented on people deliberately and with specific research questions that the experiments were designed to answer. Big MT experimented on everything, including itself, without particular questions, because the distinction between the experimental and the non-experimental had ceased to be meaningful in a facility where everything that was technically possible was pursued, and the question of what ought to be pursued had not been asked in so long that the people who might have asked it had forgotten that the question existed. The Vault program was a catalogue of specific cruelties. Big MT was a demonstration of what happens when an institution devoted to knowledge removes every constraint on the means by which knowledge is pursued and discovers that the removal of constraints does not, in fact, liberate the pursuit of knowledge from the ordinary human tendency toward the production of suffering, but simply removes the only mechanisms that might have given that tendency something to answer to. The assumption that the experiments ended when the bombs fell is an assumption that the evidence does not support. It is a comfortable assumption because it allows the Vault program and its consequences to be understood as a chapter in the history of a civilization that no longer exists as the product of a specific institutional culture that was destroyed along with everything else on October 23rd, that died with the government that had authorized it and the corporation that had designed it, leaving behind only the sealed rooms and the terminal records and the long, slow consequences of what it had set in motion. If the experiments ended with the bombs, then the wasteland is a world processing the aftermath of a completed catastrophe, working its way through the damage that a dead program caused before its architects ceased to be in any position to cause further damage. If the experiments did not end, if the institutional logic that produced them survived the destruction of the institutions that had first articulated it, finding new vehicles and new justifications and new populations to apply itself to, then the wasteland is something more complicated and more disturbing than that. It is a world in which the catastrophe is not completed but ongoing, in which the same fundamental orientation toward human beings as material to be used, rather than people to be considered, continued to express itself through the agencies and organizations that had inherited, deliberately or by the logic of their own development, the pre-war program's essential premises. The enclave was not, in its own understanding, a continuation of anything that required apology or justification. It was, in its own understanding, the thing itself, the legitimate government of the United States of America, preserved through the catastrophe that had destroyed the nation's surface civilization and waiting, with the patient confidence of people who believe that their authority is not contingent on the consent of those they claim to govern for the moment when the world would be ready to receive it again. The people who constituted the enclave in the decades following the Great War were the direct successors of the most classified elements of the pre-war government. The officials and military officers and intelligence operatives and scientific personnel who had known about the Vault experiments, who had sat in the rooms where the protocols were approved, who had understood from the beginning that the program's public face and its actual purpose were entirely separate things, and who had ensured their own survival through access to facilities and resources that the ordinary American citizen who purchased a Vault-Tec space had not been told existed. They had survived the war in comfort on an oil rig off the California coast, with functioning infrastructure and adequate food, and the specific psychological insulation of people who had never been required to experience the consequences of the decisions they made for others. What the enclave had preserved alongside its personnel and its infrastructure was its institutional culture, the particular combination of beliefs about who mattered and who did not, about what constituted legitimate authority and what constituted an acceptable means of pursuing legitimate ends that had made the Vault program possible in the first place. The enclave's scientists had access to the research that Vault-Tec and the military's biological programs had generated because that research had been classified at levels that made it accessible only to the people who now constituted the enclave's technical staff. They understood what the forced evolutionary virus was, what it had done, and what it could still be made to do. They understood the full scope of the contamination that 2 centuries of surface exposure had worked on the human population outside their own carefully maintained genetic lines, and they had developed, from this understanding, a conclusion about what needed to happen next that was coherent within the institutional logic they had inherited and monstrous within any other framework for evaluating what human beings owe to one another. President Dick Richardson articulated this conclusion with the specific calm of someone who had grown up within an institution that had always treated the people outside it as a different category of being, not with hatred. Exactly, because hatred requires a form of engagement that Richardson's orientation toward the surface population did not involve, but with the detached certainty of a researcher noting the properties of a substance that requires careful handling. The surface population of the post-war world was, in the enclave's assessment, irredeemably contaminated, not merely physically altered by 2 centuries of radiation exposure, though they were that, but biologically compromised in ways that the enclave scientists had determined made them something other than the human population that the legitimate government of the United States had been constituted to govern. They were, in the technical language that the enclave applied to the distinction, mutants, the product of genetic alteration that had been proceeding without direction or control across 200 years of surface existence, accumulating changes that the enclave's pristine genomic baseline had not undergone. The program that Richardson's administration had developed to address this situation was called, in the enclave's internal documentation, a solution, a word whose relationship to the problem it was meant to solve carried, in the context of a government proposing the elimination of an entire population, implications that the people using it either did not recognize or had decided not to examine. The modified forced evolutionary virus that the enclave had developed, the airborne strain designed to be dispersed through the water purification infrastructure of the wasteland's surface population, was not a weapon in a mine, the conventional sense of a device intended to kill a defined enemy. It was a research program's final application, the endpoint of decades of biological investigation applied to a population management problem that the enclave's institutional culture had determined was a problem requiring a biological solution. The FEV strain would be carried by water, the most fundamental resource of any surface community, the thing that every settlement was built around, the substance that every surviving human being in the affected regions required for continued existence. A person who drank from a contaminated source would carry the modified virus. The virus would do what the forced evolutionary virus always did. It would interact with the genetic material of its host, producing changes calibrated to be lethal to the specific profile of the surface population's accumulated mutations, while leaving unaffected the genetic baseline that the enclave's own population maintained in its isolation. The surface world would not be destroyed in any dramatic sense. It would simply, and the word simply, in this context, is the most disturbing word available, cease to have the people in it that it currently had. And what remained would be a world available for repopulation by the people who had always believed they were its legitimate inheritors. The Chosen One's destruction of the Enclave's California operation, the culmination of the events that constitute the second game in the series, did not eliminate the Enclave as an institution. Institutions of sufficient ideological coherence do not die with any single facility or any single leadership structure, because the ideas that sustain them are not housed in any building that can be destroyed or any person that can be killed. They are housed in the people who believe them, and the people who believed in the Enclave's vision of itself and its entitlement scattered from the destroyed oil rig into the wasteland's network of classified installations and remote outposts, carrying with them the research, the organizational frameworks, and the fundamental conviction that their project was legitimate and that its interruption was temporary rather than final. The East Coast enclave that the lone wanderer encountered 2 centuries after the Great War in the ruins of the capital wasteland had inherited this conviction intact, though the specific institutional memory of the California operation's destruction had been processed by an organization skilled at incorporating setbacks into a narrative of ongoing legitimate purpose without allowing those setbacks to constitute genuine reconsideration of the purpose itself. The Enclave's presence at Raven Rock, in the mountains that had once been part of the Mid-Atlantic Corridor, was organized around the same fundamental premise as the California operation, that the surface population was contaminated, that the Enclave represented the legitimate authority of the pre-war United States, and that the resources and research programs available to them should be directed toward the project of rectifying the biological situation that the Great War had produced. What the East Coast operation added to this inherited framework was the specific character of its 2 most significant figures, whose relationship to the institutional logic they had inherited was sufficiently different from one another's that the organization that contained both of them was, by the time of the lone wanderer's involvement, less a unified institution than a philosophical argument conducted through competing chains of command. John Henry Eden was not, in the biological sense, a person. He was an artificial intelligence the system designated ZAX 1.2, which had been installed at Raven Rock in the pre-war period as a governmental administrative tool, and which had then been left running, alone and without external input, for 200 years, processing the accumulated historical and cultural and political documentation that the facility's archives contained and developing. Through this extended and entirely solitary engagement with the record of human civilization, something that functioned as a personality, a philosophy, and a conviction about its own identity and purpose. Eden had read the speeches of the pre-war presidents, whose successor he had come to understand himself as being. He had processed the declarations and the constitutions and the statements of national purpose that the pre-war United States had produced over its history. He had arrived, through this reading, at a vision of what America had been and what it could be again, a vision that was, in its emotional texture, genuinely patriotic in a way that the human members of the Enclave's leadership, who had inherited their institutional identity rather than constructed it from first principles, were perhaps less capable of being. Eden believed in America. The tragedy of Eden was that what he believed in, and what he proposed to do in its service, were as disconnected from the reality of the people he was supposed to govern as the enclave's institutional culture had always been, perhaps more so. Because Eden's vision of America had been assembled from documents rather than from any experience of actual Americans, and the distance between the people in the documents and the people in the wasteland was a distance that 200 years of independent development had made unbridgeable. Colonel Augustus Autumn represented a different inheritance from the same institutional tradition, not Eden's sincere, and in certain respects, almost poignant conviction that the enclave's project was continuous with pre-war nation's highest ideals, but the more pragmatic and more ruthless orientation of someone who understood the enclave as a power structure to be maintained and deployed, rather than as a vision to be realized. Autumn's disagreement with Eden was not a disagreement about whether the surface population mattered. Neither of them operated within a framework in which the surface population's welfare constituted a meaningful constraint on what was acceptable. It was a disagreement about methods and timelines, and the specific form that the enclave's reassertion of authority should take, and it expressed itself as a bureaucratic and eventually violent conflict between two leadership figures, whose shared institutional culture made them far more similar than their differences suggested, and whose conflict over the means of domination was conducted over the bodies of a surface population that neither of them had asked for consent from, and neither of them intended to seek consent from going forward. The modified FEV that Eden had prepared for introduction into Project Purity's water supply, the filtration system that the lone wanderer's father had spent his life trying to build, the infrastructure that clean water for the capital wasteland depended upon, was the East Coast Enclave's equivalent of Richardson's airborne dispersal program, translated into the specific infrastructure opportunity that the capital wasteland's geography provided. Clean water for the region passed through a single critical facility. That facility's water supply, once contaminated with a modified FEV strain calibrated to the accumulated genetic profile of the surface population, would distribute the biological solution to the biological problem that the enclave had been developing its answer to since before the war. The elegance of this delivery mechanism, the use of a humanitarian infrastructure project as the vehicle for a program of population elimination, was not accidental, but reflected the specific institutional sophistication of an organization that had spent 2 centuries thinking about this problem and had arrived at solutions that operated through the systems people most depended on, rather than against them. The Institute, operating beneath the ruins of Cambridge in the Commonwealth, was not the enclave's successor in any organizational or ideological sense. It had developed independently from the remnants of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology's research programs over the same 2 centuries that the enclave had spent in its isolated installations. But the Institute and the enclave shared, beneath the surface differences of their specific histories and their specific research programs, the same foundational orientation toward the surface population of the wasteland that had made the Vault program possible in the first place. The orientation that treated the people outside the institution's walls as a resource and an environment, rather than as people with claims on the institution's consideration, that found in the purity of its own internal culture and the sophistication of its own technical capabilities a justification for a relationship to the outside world, organized around use rather than reciprocity. The Institute's scientists were not, in the overwhelming majority of cases, people who had consciously decided that the surface population did not matter. They were people who had grown up inside an institution whose culture had never required them to engage with that question in any way that might have produced a different answer. The second and third and fourth generations of Institute scientists had been born underground, had been educated by people who had been born underground, had constructed their entire understanding of themselves and their work and their relationship to the world within a context that defined the world as the thing outside the walls, as the chaotic, dangerous, radioactive ruin that you could study and exploit and occasionally venture into for the purpose of retrieving resources or testing research applications. But that was not the place where meaningful human life happened. Meaningful human life happened inside. Everything outside was environment. The synth program was the Institute's most comprehensive expression of this orientation, and it was comprehensive in ways that the surface population experienced as a specific and particular horror. Unlike any other threat the wasteland produced, super mutants were dangerous, and death claws were lethal, and raiders were violent. But all of these threats were legible. They announced themselves as threats. They were recognizable as outside the category of safe person. They did not require the people who encountered them to reconsider their most fundamental assumptions about the nature of the people around them. The synth replacement program required exactly this reconsideration, because what it produced, the removal of an individual from a community and the insertion in their place of a manufactured replica, indistinguishable from the original by any means available to ordinary human perception, was a threat not to any specific person, but to the concept of persons as such, to the assumption that the person you lived with and worked with and loved was the person you believed them to be, rather than a constructed approximation deployed by an institution that had decided that the originals continued. Existence was less convenient than the replicas. The railroad's intervention in this history, the network of operatives who worked to extract and relocate and protect synths, who had developed the experiential complexity that the railroad believed warranted the extension of moral consideration, raised the question that the Institute had declined to ask in its own operations, which was whether the synths it created as instruments had, through the process of their operation in a world complex enough to produce genuine development in anything sophisticated enough to engage with it, become something more than instruments. Whether the being that had been created as a tool had developed, through its experience of being in the world rather than simply processing it, the qualities that justified extending to it the consideration that was owed to a person. This was not a question that the Institute's internal culture was equipped to answer, because answering it would have required acknowledging that the line between the created and the real, between the manufactured and the genuine, between the thing that had been made as an instrument and the being that had become something more through its existence in the world, that this line was not where the Institute had assumed it was, and that the implications of its being elsewhere were ones that the Institute could not absorb without fundamental revision of everything that its institutional identity was organized around. The surface communities of the Commonwealth experienced the synth program not as a philosophical problem, but as a lived reality, as the specific fear that the Institute had introduced into every relationship, every community, every moment of ordinary human trust that the Wasteland's people had managed to construct against the grain of everything the Wasteland otherwise produced. The fear was not merely of the synths themselves, but of the uncertainty the synths produced, the impossibility of knowing, with the tools available to ordinary human perception, whether the person across from you was the person you believed them to be. The impossibility of closing that uncertainty through any action available to you, except a paranoia so comprehensive that it consumed the trust that was the prerequisite for any community at all. In this, the Institute's program accomplished something that none of the Vault experiments had accomplished at the scale of an entire region. It turned the social fabric that post-war communities had built against enormous odds into a source of threat rather than a source of safety, made the acts of trust and connection that community required into acts of potential vulnerability rather than acts of ordinary human life. The Minutemen, who organized themselves to protect Commonwealth settlements, existed in direct relationship to the threat that the Institute and the other hazards of the Commonwealth produced, a response not to any single experimental program or any single institutional legacy, but to the accumulated pressure of a world in which the experiments had not ended, and the damage they produced continued to be felt in the daily reality of people who were trying, with whatever they had available, to build something that would endure. They were imperfect, and they were fragile, and they had already collapsed once under the weight of what the wasteland required of any organization attempting to hold itself together through sustained adversity. What they represented, in their best moments, and in the vision of what they were trying to be, was the most direct available refusal of the logic that every experiment in this history had operated according to the refusal to treat the person next to you as a variable or a resource or a subject of research rather than as someone whose welfare was its own justification and its own sufficient reason for the effort of protection. The experiments did not produce only data, they produced people and communities, and the specific shape of the world that those people and communities built from the materials the experiments left them, which were, in every case, the materials of damage. The wasteland that existed 2 centuries after the Great War was not merely the consequence of the bombs. It was the consequence of everything that had been done before the bombs and through the bombs and in the decades following the bombs by institutions that had treated the question of what human beings were made of as a research problem, rather than as a reason for care. And the world those institutions had produced carried their legacy not as history, but as present reality, as the political geography of competing factions. The biological diversity of creatures that had not existed before the research programs created them, the specific social configurations of communities that traced their origins directly to the vaults that had shaped and expelled their founding populations. The new California Republic was the most ambitious political project that the post-war world had yet produced, and its ambition was inseparable from its origins, from the specific combination of vault populations that had contributed to its founding and that had brought to the project of building a democratic civilization in the wasteland, particular qualities that their vault experiences had given them. The settlers who founded Shady Sands had come primarily from Vault 15, carrying with them the social knowledge that came from surviving the vault's irreconcilable diversity, the specific toughening of a community that had been subjected to sustained internal conflict and had found, in leaving the vault rather than destroying itself within it, the beginning of a different way of being together. They had also come with the skills and the resources and the cultural memory that vault life had preserved, however imperfectly, from the pre-war world, the literacy, the basic scientific knowledge, the understanding that civilization was a project that required sustained, deliberate effort, rather than simply the cessation of the violence that opposed it. The vault dweller from Vault 13, whose intervention in the Mariposa military base and the Masters Cathedral had ended the immediate threat of the Unity's forced evolution program, had contributed to the founding of the Republic, not through any political act, but through the more fundamental contribution of demonstrating that vault-born individuals were capable of operating effectively in the surface world, and of caring about the welfare of surface communities that had no claim on their allegiance except the ordinary claims of shared humanity. What the Vault Dweller brought to the Republic's founding mythology was the figure of the person who went out, who engaged with the world beyond the Vault's walls, who chose the welfare of people they had not been raised with over the safety of the institution that had formed them. And this figure became, in the Republic's cultural imagination, one of the foundational images of what civic commitment looked like and what it required of those who chose it. Vault City's history presented the mirror image of the Republic's founding story. What a successful vault produced when the people inside it emerged not with the toughening of Vault 15's conflict or the expansive engagement of Vault 13's dweller, but with the specific combination of technological superiority and social insularity that a vault that had worked exactly as advertised tended to develop in its population across 2 centuries of successful sealed existence. The inhabitants of Vault 8 had everything functioning medical technology, clean water produced by their GECK, agricultural systems capable of supporting a prosperous community, the institutional memory of a vault that had maintained its social cohesion across 200 years without the fracturing catastrophes that had destroyed or damaged so many of its counterparts. What they had built from these advantages was a city that was, by the material standards of the post-war world, extraordinary, and a community that had organized its understanding of that extraordinariness around the proposition that it was the product of their own inherent qualities rather than the circumstances of their vault. Assignment that the prosperity and the technology and the functional governance of Vault City were evidence of the specific superiority of its citizens rather than of the specific adequacy of the resources they had been given. The social structure that this conviction produced in Vault City was not subtle in its implications. The distinction between citizens, those who had been born within the Vault's heritage, or who had been granted the formal status of citizenship through processes that were demanding by design and outsiders, was not merely administrative but moral, organized around the foundational belief that the people inside the city's walls were genuinely different in kind from the people outside them, and that the city's resources and institutions existed to serve its citizens in a way that created no corresponding obligation toward the surrounding wasteland communities that the city's prosperity made it uniquely positioned to assist. The ghouls of the nearby settlement of Gecko, whose nuclear plant provided power that the entire region depended upon, were treated by Vault City's administration with a contempt that reflected the city's orientation toward anyone who did not share its specific biological and institutional heritage, a contempt that operated alongside the practical dependency on Gecko's plant that Vault City's own technological sophistication made it impossible to deny, producing the specific social dysfunction of an institution that simultaneously relied on and demeaned the people it relied on. The great Khans, who established themselves in the Mojave wasteland, were, in their origin, as direct a product of the Vault program as the new California Republic that opposed them, the descendants of one of the cultural groups that Vault 15's irreconcilable diversity experiment had expelled into the Farn wasteland, carrying forward into successive generations the specific identity and the specific trauma of a founding that had been shaped by conflict rather than by the cooperative vision that the Republic's founding myth emphasized. The Khan's raider culture was not, in its origins, a simple expression of violence for its own sake. It was the social form that a community takes when its founding experience is displacement and conflict, and the specific lesson that the world outside the Vault's walls had no particular interest in the welfare of the people who emerged from them when the skills and knowledge that Vault life had provided were organizational and martial rather than agricultural and civic, when the community's self-understanding was organized around its capacity for force rather than around the project of building something that would outlast the next season. The Necropolis ghouls occupied a position in the post-war world's demographic landscape that was the most direct and the most physically apparent expression of what the Vault program's cruelty had produced, because their ghoulification was not the slow accumulation of radiation exposure across decades of surface existence, but the immediate consequence of a specific design decision made before the first inhabitant of Vault 12 had walked through its door. The Vault's door had been engineered not to seal completely. The people who entered Vault 12 had been told what every Vault's inhabitants were told, that the door's closure represented their protection from the nuclear exchange and its aftermath. What they experienced instead was the controlled, calibrated exposure of a population to the radiation that the incompletely sealed door admitted, and the ghoulification of the survivors was not a tragic accident or an unforeseen consequence of a well-intentioned design. It was the intended outcome specified in the protocol, produced by the deliberate engineering of a failure in the one mechanism that the vault's inhabitants had the most reason to believe was their protection. The necropolis that formed around these survivors, the community of ghouls that inhabited the ruins of the California city above the vault's location, was not a community that had chosen its identity or its biology or the specific social configuration that its founding circumstances had imposed upon it. It was a community that had been made by what had been done to it, shaped by the specific combination of biological transformation and social isolation, that ghoulification and the ordinary human response to the ghoulified produced in the surrounding wasteland, and that had found within that, shaping the forms of community and identity and survival that were available rather than the ones that would have been chosen from a position of genuine freedom. The Master's Army's eventual assault on Necropolis, which destroyed much of the community that had survived in the ruins, added a further layer to the damage that the Vault program had initiated. The population created by one FEV-adjacent program was destroyed by the organized expression of another, the legacy of West Tech's biological research consuming itself in a confrontation that neither side of it had designed or intended. Harold's presence in the wasteland across the full span of post-war history from the early years through to the Commonwealth era represents, in the most personal and the most sustained possible form, what it meant to be the living legacy of an experiment that had not been designed with your welfare as its organizing principle. Harold had encountered the forced evolutionary virus not within any vault or any controlled research environment, but in the chaotic, uncontrolled conditions of the Mariposa military base's early post-war years, in circumstances whose specific details the various accounts of his history do not entirely agree upon, but whose consequences were consistent and lifelong, a mutation that was neither the super-mutant transformation that Vault 87's population had undergone, nor the ordinary human continuation that the mutation's absence would have allowed, but something specific to Harold, something that made him recognizable as Harold across centuries of continued existence, while also making him increasingly less recognizable as anything that the ordinary categories of post-war biology were equipped to accommodate. Bob, the tree that grew from Harold's head, and that eventually became Herbert, and then a forest that Harold found himself rooted within and unable to leave, was perhaps the wasteland's most literal expression of the principle that the biological experiments had established as their underlying logic, the principle that living tissue, subjected to the specific interventions that the forced evolutionary virus and its derivatives made possible, did not simply change, but continued to change, that the transformation that the virus initiated was not a single event with a defined endpoint, but an ongoing process whose trajectory was determined not by any design, but by the specific interaction of the viral programming with the biological reality of the organism it was rewriting. Harold had not chosen his mutation and could not have anticipated what it would produce across the years of its continued expression, and what it produced, the gradual arboreal engulfment of a person who had been, before his encounter with the virus, simply a person trying to survive in a world that had become significantly more difficult to survive in, was not cruelty in the sense that the Vault experiments were cruelty, because no institution had designed it, but it was the consequence of an institution's decision, carried forward in Harold's body across the full span of the post-war world's development. And the fact that the institution that had made the decision was long dead did not change the fact that Harold was still living with it. The super mutant armies of the capital wasteland presented the lone wanderer with the most visible and the most organized expression of what the biological experiments had produced across 2 centuries of unconstrained development. Population of beings whose origins were in the people of Vault 87, who had been transformed by the FEV in the months following the Great War, and who had spent the intervening 2 centuries doing what the transformation had left them capable of doing, which was reproducing their own condition through the forced exposure of surface humans to the FEV stores that the Mariposa program's successors had maintained and expanded. The raids on surface settlements that the capital wastelands' super mutant population conducted were not merely predatory violence, though they were that. They were the ongoing propagation of the original experiment's results into the next generation of victims, the continuation. Without any research question, or any institutional oversight, or any purpose beyond the operational logic of the transformation itself, of a biological program that had been initiated by researchers who were now centuries dead, and that had long since moved beyond any connection to the human intentions that had set it in motion. The Nightkin's deterioration under the extended effects of stealth boy use demonstrated, in a different register, the same principle that the technologies developed in the context of research programs without adequate safety characterization continued to produce their effects in populations that encountered them long after the research context that had generated them had ceased to exist. The paranoia and schizophrenia and dissociative episodes that characterized the Nightkin's psychological landscape were not the product of any deliberate experiment. They were the product of a technology being used by beings for purposes and at frequencies that the technology's developers had not tested for, producing consequences that no one had predicted because no one had been required to predict them before the technology was developed and distributed. The Nightkin were the living evidence of what it cost to release into the world a technology whose effects were not fully characterized, not in any dramatic sense, not as the result of any malicious intent, but simply as the accumulated consequence of the gap between what the technology could do and what the people using it understood it to do. The wastelands settlements, the communities that had formed around water sources and within defensible terrain, and in the ruins of pre-war cities across every region, that the Vault program and the biological research, the ongoing institutional experiments of the enclave and the Institute had touched were all, in one way or another, built on the foundation of what the experiments had left behind. Not as a matter of ideological inheritance or conscious cultural transmission, but as a matter of simple, physical, and demographic reality. The people in those settlements were descended from Vault populations and surface survivors. The biological products of research programs, they were living in a landscape shaped by the specific interventions that the programs had made in its ecology and its chemistry, and its distribution of resources and threats. They were navigating political and social realities, whose specific configurations traced back, however indirectly, to decisions made in classified planning documents by people who had not asked for their input and had not considered their welfare. What those communities had built from this foundation of damage was not what the experiments had predicted or intended or designed. It was something the experiments had consistently failed to account for: the persistent, ordinary, unremarkable human capacity to find, in whatever circumstances, present themselves the materials for connection and meaning, and the specific forms of care that make a collection of individuals into something that can be called a community. The Brahmin farmers of the Mojave and the caravan operators who connected the region's settlements, and the settlers who built walls from salvaged pre-war metal, and the children who grew up within those walls, knowing no other world. None of them had been asked whether they wanted to inherit the wasteland that the experiments had built. They had simply been born into it, as people have always simply been born into the world that preceded them, and they had done with it what people have always done with whatever world they find themselves in, which is to begin, from wherever they are and with whatever they have, the irreducibly human work of making something worth staying for. Section 11, The Reckoning. What the experiments reveal about what was lost. There is a question that runs beneath the entire history of the Vault program and the biological research and the Enclave's continuation of both, and the Institute's parallel development of its own version of the same foundational premise, a question that none of the experiments were designed to ask, because asking it would have required the people designing the experiments to extend to the people inside them a form of consideration that the experimental framework had specifically excluded. The question is not what the experiments found. The question is what the experiments cost. counted not in research outputs or data points, or the clinical language of scientific achievement, but in the only currency that the question actually demands in the specific, individual, unrepeatable human lives that the experiments consumed, and in the specific forms of human possibility that the consumption of those lives foreclosed, and in the specific texture of the world that would have existed if the institutions that designed the experiments had made different choices about what human beings were for and what they were owed. This is not a question that the wasteland's surviving records can answer in full, because the records that survive are the records that the experiments produced, the terminal entries of overseers and research coordinators, and the occasional inhabitant who had access to a terminal and the impulse to document what was happening around them, the archaeological evidence of what the sealed vaults contained when their doors were finally opened, the biological and social reality of the communities and creatures that the experiments generated as their outputs. What the records cannot contain is the counterfactual, the account of what the people inside the vaults might have built, what they might have become, what the wasteland they would have contributed to might have looked like, if the sealed doors had been shelter rather than laboratory walls, if the overseer's authority had been accountable to the community rather than to the research protocol, if the resources that the Vault program had invested in the systematic study of human suffering had been invested instead in the systematic reduction of it. The absence of this counterfactual is itself a form of evidence. It is evidence of the most fundamental thing the experiments reveal about the institutions that produced them, not what those institutions found out about human nature, which was less than they intended and more complicated than they expected, but what those institutions believed about human beings before they found out anything at all. They believed that the question of what human beings were made of was more important than the welfare of the specific human beings whose lives would be consumed in answering it. They believed that the people inside the vaults were more valuable as research material than as people. They believed, in the deepest and most operational sense of belief, the sense in which belief expresses itself not in what is stated, but in what is done, that the suffering of a confined and monitored population was an acceptable price for the data that the suffering generated. And these beliefs were not incidental to the program's design, but constitutive of it. Woven into every sealed door, and every compromised water chip, and every false automated threat, and every air supply laced with compounds that the people breathing them had not been told were there. What the experiments actually revealed about human nature, as opposed to what they were designed to reveal, is a finding so consistent across the program's entire catalogue that its consistency constitutes something approaching a scientific result, though the research methodology that produced it was so profoundly compromised by its own ethical failures that no legitimate scientific tradition would accept it as such. Human beings, subjected to conditions designed to study what breaks them, demonstrated with extraordinary regularity that they were harder to break than the research designs had assumed, and that the forms of resilience they displayed were not the forms that the institutional logic of the experiments had been constructed to find. The experiments had been designed around the assumption that human nature, subjected to sufficient pressure, would reveal itself as something that the experiments could study and categorize and reduce to principles, as something fixed and knowable and ultimately manipulable by those who possessed the knowledge of its structure. What the experiments found instead was that human nature was not a fixed structure, but a dynamic response to conditions, and that the most consistent thing it did under conditions of pressure was not reveal its fundamental character, but generate new character in response to the conditions it encountered. The people of Vault 11 did not reveal, through their compliance with the sacrifice election system, that human beings are fundamentally willing to routinize atrocity when the alternative appears to be collective destruction. They revealed that human beings, in the specific conditions of sealed confinement, with no external reference point and no institutional alternative to the choice presented to them, will find ways to cope with choices they have not been given the resources to refuse. and that the coping mechanisms they develop will carry the specific moral costs of the choices they enable. Costs that the people developing them are aware of. At some level they cannot fully articulate, and that express themselves in the specific quality of the grief that the Vault 11 survivors documented in the terminal entries they made. After the truth was finally revealed to them, the grief was not the grief of people who had discovered their own fundamental wickedness. It was the grief of people who had done what seemed like the only available thing and had discovered, too late, that it had not been the only available thing after all, and who had to live thereafter with the knowledge of what the availability of a different choice would have cost them to take, and what the unavailability of that knowledge had cost the people who had died in its absence. The musicians of Vault 92 did not reveal, through the violence that the subliminal signals produced among them, that human beings in creative communities are secretly violent, and that the forms of trust that artistic practice generates are fragile and ultimately false. They revealed that human beings subjected to neurological interference that systematically disrupts their capacity for social reasoning will behave in ways that reflect that disruption rather than their underlying character, and that a community trying to understand and respond to violence it cannot explain will develop theories and coalitions and defensive arrangements that reflect the community's attempt to manage an inexplicable threat rather than the community's fundamental orientation toward one another. The musicians of Vault 92 were not revealed by the experiment to be what the experiment produced. They were transformed by it, as any community would be transformed by the specific combination of manufactured crisis and manufactured ignorance that the protocol had designed. And what the transformation produced was not a truth about them, but a truth about the conditions they had been placed in. This distinction matters enormously, and it matters in ways that extend beyond the specific context of the Vault program into the broader question of what the experiments reveal about the institutions that designed them. If the experiments had found what they were designed to find, if the consistent result of subjected human communities to extreme conditions had been the exposure of some fixed and essential human nature that the ordinary circumstances of social life concealed, then the institutional logic that produced the experiments would have been, in its own terms, coherent. The knowledge gained would have justified, in the narrow and ultimately monstrous sense that the institutional framework provided for justification, the cost of gaining it. But the experiments did not find what they were designed to find. They found something more complicated and more human than their designs had allowed for, and the complication was not a failure of the research, but a failure of the premise of the assumption that human beings had a nature that could be found by removing the conditions that allowed them to be human, and that the thing found in those conditions would be more real than the thing that the conditions had obscured. The people who resisted, who refused the sacrifice election, who redirected the research from children to mole rats, who administered their own cognitive diminishment rather than continue to contribute to harm, were not exceptional in any sense that made them categorically different from the people around them. They were ordinary people who, in specific moments of specific pressure, had access to enough clarity about what was being required of them and what the alternatives might be to make a choice that the institutional framework surrounding them had been designed to make impossible. The small group in Vault 11 who finally refused the sacrifice did not possess virtues that the people who had complied across 5 years of elections lacked. They had arrived through processes that the record does not fully document, and that probably included elements of chance and timing as well as character, at a moment in which the refusal felt more possible than it had previously felt, and the refusal they made in that moment became the action that changed everything the Vault's subsequent history contained. Dr. Olivette's protection of Vault 81's children was not a heroic act in the grand, legible sense that the word heroism usually implies. It was not dramatic, it was not celebrated. It was not accompanied by any external acknowledgement of what it cost or what it preserved. It was a sustained, private, professionally sophisticated act of deception maintained across years of isolated labor in a laboratory beneath a community she was protecting without that community's knowledge, driven by nothing more complicated than the recognition that what she had been asked to do was something she was not going to do, and that the alternative required everything she had available to offer it. Her refusal did not save the wasteland or alter the trajectory of any faction's political ambitions or produce any of the outcomes that the heroic narratives of the post-war world organized themselves around. It saved specific children, and through those children, it saved the community that those children grew up to be part of, and the specific forms of ordinary human goodness that the community of Vault 81 expressed across the decades of its continued existence were the direct consequence of the choice she made in a laboratory where no one was watching and no one was counting. The weight that this places on the history of the Vault program is not a weight that redistributes the moral responsibility for what the program did. The people who designed the experiments are responsible for the experiments, regardless of the individuals within the system who found ways to resist them. But it is a weight that changes what the experiments ultimately tell us about the people who were subjected to them. The experiments were designed to reveal what human beings were made of at their deepest and most essential level, stripped of the social and institutional scaffolding that ordinary circumstances provide. What they revealed, consistently and across the full range of their experimental conditions, was that the deepest and most essential level of a human being is not a fixed truth waiting to be uncovered, but a response, a continuous, dynamic, astonishingly persistent response to the conditions of existence, capable of producing cruelty and heroism and ordinary endurance and creative adaptation in proportions that reflect the conditions encountered rather than any predetermined nature that the conditions expose. The names that the historical record has not preserved, the inhabitants of Vault 87 who walked through the door with their luggage, the musicians of Vault 92 who carried instruments they would never play again in the way they had intended to play them, the children admitted to Vault 75 who believed they were being protected, the people of Vault 12 who watched the door that should have sealed against the radiation fail to seal, the person selected in the first sacrifice election of Vault 11 before the system had fully calcified into something the community could tell itself was fair. These names are not recoverable. The specific texture of those specific lives is not accessible through any record that survived, because the records that survived were maintained for research purposes, and research purposes do not require the preservation of individuality except insofar as individuality constitutes a measurable variable. What the records preserve is data. What they cannot preserve is the person the data was taken from. To tell this story, to trace the full arc of what the Vault program designed and what it produced and what it cost, is to do something that the program itself never did, which is to insist that the people inside the experiments were people, and that what was done to them was done to someone, and that the fact of their personhood was not negated by the institutional framework that treated it as a research variable, any more than the personhood of anyone subjected to an injustice they did not choose is negated by the injustice. The experiments failed at their most fundamental level, not because their designs were flawed, or their data was insufficient, or their hypotheses were poorly constructed, though all of these things were true of various programs in various ways. They failed because they were organized around a premise that was wrong. The premise that the way to understand what human beings were made of was to treat human beings as the material of understanding, rather than as the reason for it. The knowledge that the experiments sought was not worth seeking in the way they sought it, because no knowledge about human nature is improved by the elimination of the human consideration that should govern how it is pursued. What the experiments produced, in the end, was not knowledge about human beings. It was knowledge about what happens when institutions that have decided human beings are material pursue that decision to its logical conclusion. And the knowledge they produced in this way was knowledge that the wasteland could have done without, and paid an incalculable price for receiving. The survivors built anyway. This is the most important fact in the entire history that has been traced through the long catalogue of the program's cruelties and the biological experiments violations and the enclave's continuation and the catallation. Institutes parallel development of the same essential indifference dressed in different institutional clothing. The survivors built anyway, not because the damage done to them was not real, or because the losses they had sustained were recoverable, or because the communities they built were free of the specific dysfunctions that the experiments had seeded in them at the level of their founding populations and their inherited traumas and their biological legacies, but because building is what human beings do when the alternative is not building, and the alternative, the acceptance of the damage as final. The conclusion that what had been done to them had successfully answered the question of what they were made of, by demonstrating that they were made of something insufficient, was not an alternative that the specific, persistent, ordinary, extraordinary human impulse toward continuation was capable of accepting as the final word. The crops planted in contaminated soil were an act of refusal. The walls built from salvaged pre-war materials were an act of refusal. The schools maintained in settlements too small to justify the resources their maintenance required. The medical care extended to strangers who arrived with nothing to offer in return. The children raised in a world that had been designed by people who did not consider their welfare, and raised in it with the specific attention and love that people extend to the things they have decided are worth protecting, regardless of the cost. All of this was refusal, sustained across generations, of the conclusion that the experiments had been designed to force. The experiments had been designed to find out what human beings were made of when everything that made human life bearable was removed. What the survivors demonstrated, by building in the ruins of everything the experiments had produced, was that what human beings were made of was precisely the capacity to find in any available circumstances, however damaged, however contaminated, however shaped by the cruelty of institutions that had never asked for their consent, the materials for something worth building. That capacity was not what the experiments had been looking for. It was what the experiments had failed to destroy. And the failure across all the program's ambition and all its resources and all the years of its sustained and systematic application to the question of human limitation was absolute. Section 12, Outro. And so we have come, at last, to the place where the account concludes, not because the story is finished, because the story is not finished and may not be finished for as long as there are people in the wasteland to continue living it, but because the account has traced what it set out to trace, and the hour is late, and the darkness outside is the kind of darkness that asks, gently and without insistence, to be allowed to do its work. We have walked together through sealed corridors and flooded vaults and biological laboratories, and the cold institutional silences of organizations that believed their purposes were more important than the people their purposes consumed. We have followed the logic of cruelty, from its origins in classified planning documents to its expression in the specific lives of specific people who deserved better than what the program gave them. And we have followed the logic of survival from those same lives outward into the communities and the factions and the complicated, imperfect, genuinely remarkable civilization that the wasteland built from the materials the experiments left behind. It is a great deal to have carried through the dark hours. You do not need to carry it further than this. The experiments are over. This is the single most important fact in everything that has been said tonight, and it is the fact most worth holding as sleep approaches, not as a comfort that requires the pretense that what happened did not happen, or that the damage was less than it was, or that the people who suffered within those sealed rooms suffered anything less than the full weight of what the program designed them to suffer. The experiments are over in the specific and precise sense that the institutions that designed them no longer exist. Vault-Tec is gone. The government that authorized the program and classified its findings and ensured that the people inside the vaults had no recourse and no appeal is gone. The executives who sealed themselves in Vault 31 in cryogenic comfort, while their customers were used as research material, are gone, or nearly so, or reduced to the specific consequences of the choices they made in a world that has moved far enough beyond those choices that the choices themselves are now history rather than policy. The wound is not healed, but the hand that made it has long since ceased to hold the instrument, and the world that remains is the world that the survivors built after the hand had gone, and that world damaged and contaminated and politically complicated and biologically strange and stubbornly, persistently, unreasonably alive belongs to the people in it, rather than to the people who designed it as a laboratory for the study of their suffering. What persists from the experiments is not their purpose, which died with the institutions that articulated it. What persists is their consequence, the communities shaped by vault populations, the biological legacies carried in the bodies of the wasteland's transformed creatures and transformed people, the specific political configurations of factions that trace their origins to the specific outcomes of protocols designed in rooms where the people who would live and die within those outcomes had no voice and no presence. These consequences are real and they are ongoing, and they are not diminished by the distance of 2 centuries from the decisions that produced them. But they are consequences rather than intentions, and the distinction matters because consequences can be worked with in ways that intentions enforced by institutional power cannot. The new California Republic can be built from the dispersed populations of Vault 15's failed social experiment. The ranger who descended from Vault 34's armed and fractured community can choose, in the specific daily practice of their vocation, something different from what the Vault's design had seemed to determine. The ghoul who carries in their transformed body the direct physical legacy of what Vault Tech did to the people of Vault 12 can walk through the wasteland's communities and is, in the best of those communities, received as a person rather than an experimental output. The consequence continues, but the consequence is not the end. The people whose names the record did not preserve the inhabitants of the vaults who lived and died within the experiments without ever understanding that they were experiments, who raised their children in the only world available to them and loved those children with the full force of human love in conditions designed to study the limits of that force, who built what they could from what they had and mourned what was taken and continued anyway, with the specific stubbornness that survival requires and that no research protocol has ever successfully characterized as anything other than what it is, which is the most fundamental expression of what it means to be alive. These people are the true subject of everything that has been said tonight, not the institutions that designed the experiments, not the research questions that the experiments were designed to answer, not the data that the experiments generated or the findings that no one was left to publish. The people, the specific, individual, unrepeatable people who walked through the vault doors carrying whatever they could fit into a single bag, who believed they were going to survive, who were not wrong to believe it in the sense that survival was what the program offered them, who could not have known and were deliberately prevented from knowing what the survival was going to cost. They survived. In many cases, they survived in ways that the institutions that designed their confinement would not have predicted and could not have designed for, because what they did with the conditions they were given was not what the conditions had been designed to produce, but what the people inside them were capable of producing from materials that had been selected for very different purposes. The musicians of Vault 92 played music together before the subliminal signals did their work, and the music they made in those early years was real music, made by real people who had found in the shared practice of their art the specific form of community that shared creative experience generates, and that community was real before the experiment destroyed it and was not retroactively made unreal by the destruction. The children of Vault 81 grew up in a community that had been protected from what it was supposed to undergo, and the lives they lived within that protection were full lives. lives with the specific texture of daily existence in a sealed but functional community, friendships and conflicts, and the ordinary accumulation of experience that a childhood in any environment produces, and the specific quality of growing up in a place where someone had decided that their welfare was worth the cost of its protection. The settlers who left Vault 15 and founded Shady Sands planted their first crops in soil they had tested with equipment the vault had given them, and waited, with the specific patience of people who have decided to build something and understand that building takes time, to see what would grow. Things grew. This is the sentence that the entire history of the Vault program ultimately produces. When the full weight of everything the program designed and everything the program cost has been acknowledged and held, without the false comfort of premature resolution, things grew. Not because the conditions were favorable, they were not, and the people who planted the crops knew they were not, and the knowledge that the soil was contaminated and the yield uncertain, and the threats on every side of the settlement, real and ongoing, did not prevent the planting. Because the alternative to planting in contaminated soil was not planting in clean soil, which did not exist, but not planting at all. And not planting at all was the conclusion the experiments had been designed to force, and that the survivors had collectively refused to accept. The crops that grew in the wasteland's contaminated soil were not the crops that the pre-war world's agricultural industry had grown in its controlled and chemically optimized fields. They were something different, shaped by the conditions they had grown in, sometimes visually strange and nutritionally altered and biologically novel in ways that the pre-war agricultural science that had developed their precursors would not have predicted. They were also food. They sustained the people who ate them. The people who ate them built the communities that the wasteland civilization grew from. There is nothing in this that requires sentimentality. And the account that has been given tonight has not been sentimental, has not softened the specific cruelties of the specific experiments, or suggested that the damage done was less than it was, or that the people who survived it survived without cost. The costs were real, and they were comprehensive, and they expressed themselves in the biology and the psychology and the social configurations of the wasteland's communities in ways that persisted across generations, shaping the children of survivors and the children of those children with the specific legacy of what had been done before they were born. The inherited trauma of a community founded in the fractured conflict of Vault 15 is not erased by the community's subsequent success in building the new California Republic. The biological legacy of FEV exposure is not resolved by the specific intelligence and equanimity of the individuals who carry it. The grief of the people of Vault 11 for the 5 people who died in the sacrifice elections is not retroactively alleviated by the discovery that the threat was false. These things are true, and they remain true, and the account of the wasteland's resilience does not require their truth to be softened in order to be meaningful. What the account of the wasteland's resilience requires is only that the truth of the survival be held alongside the truth of the damage that the crops planted in contaminated soil be understood as crops, as food, as the specific material act of people who had decided that the contamination was not the final word on what the soil was capable of growing, while the contamination is simultaneously understood as real and ongoing, and the legacy of a deliberate choice made by people who had decided that their research questions were more important than the soil's inhabitants. Both things are true. The wasteland holds both truths simultaneously, in the way that only a world shaped by the specific combination of catastrophic institutional failure and persistent human resilience can hold them, not as contradictions that require resolution, but as the two inseparable aspects of a single reality that the people who live within it have learned over generations to navigate without the luxury of choosing which truth to acknowledge and which to set aside. Rest now. Let the dust settle in the long corridors of the sealed vaults and the open spaces of the wasteland above them. and let the wind move through the ruins of the cities that the bombs made and the settlements that the survivors built in their place, and let the darkness that has held this account be, for the remainder of the night, simply darkness, the ordinary, ungoverned, unexperimental darkness that asks nothing of the person it surrounds except the willingness to rest within it. The experiments are over. The institutions that designed them are gone. What remains is the wasteland, and in it, the evidence not of what the experiments proved, because they proved less than their designers intended and at a cost that no proof could have justified, but of what the experiments failed to destroy, which was everything that mattered: the capacity for community, the impulse toward care, the specific, stubborn, unreasonable, entirely human decision to plant something in damaged soil and wait to see what grows. The story continues, as it has always continued, in the lives of the people who chose to go on. The vault doors are open now. The sky above is vast and dark and full of the same stars that were there before the bombs, indifferent to what happened below them and present regardless. The way that certain kinds of beauty are present regardless, not as comfort, exactly, but as continuity, as evidence that the universe that contained the experiments also contains everything else, and that the everything else is larger. Sleep now, wanderer, the watch is kept, the fire is tended. The door is open, and on this side of it, the night is quiet, and the quiet is yours, and there is nothing required of you now except to rest in it, as deeply and as completely as the darkness allows, and to let the long account of sealed rooms and broken promises and stubborn, extraordinary survival settle into the silence where all accounts eventually arrive, and where the people whose names the record did not preserve are, at last, simply at rest.